Many empresses came from her noble Trobi family. The previous emperor Asus III chose her as a bride for the crown prince. It was a political alliance between high-ranking people. Fortunately, the young people had a good relationship despite everything. Until now, they were a good and wonderful couple. They always got together and discussed the country they would build for the next generations. At the same time, the young lady was an ideal empress. She always supported her husband no matter what. But to her regret one day, everything changed. Navier, the empress of the Eastern Empire, looking at everyone present, declared that they accepted the divorce. At that very moment, everyone present began to whisper among themselves. The young man shouted angrily that something like this simply couldn't happen. He didn't understand how something like this could have happened. But at the same time, the young lady looked at everyone present with tears in her eyes. But a moment later, she looked at everyone with a smirk. At that very moment, she felt the empress's gaze on her, and without losing her bearings, she quickly approached the emperor. Rashta looked intently at the emperor, as she did not know what they would do next. The priest asked the empress if she was ready to sign the divorce papers. She immediately sighed heavily and agreed with him. She looked intently at everyone present and declared that she accepted the divorce. The emperor breathed a sigh of relief. He felt a little sorry, but he was glad that it was all over. But at that very moment, Navier announced that she was asking for permission to remarry, and everyone was taken aback, as they had not expected such a thing. At that moment, everyone started whispering, as nothing like this had ever happened before. The empress looked at everyone present with a satisfied smile. The priest looked at the empress in bewilderment and asked if she really wanted to remarry. Everyone was shocked, but they asked her who she wanted to marry. But she didn't tell them anything. But a moment later, everyone heard a man's laughter. The young man looked at them with a satisfied smile and asked if he really needed to show himself now. Everyone was shocked because they didn't understand who was in front of them, but some still recognized the young man. The priest was puzzled and did not understand why the empress chose such a young man as a partner. The emperor also looked at his wife with puzzlement, as he did not expect such a thing. Navier looked at those present with a grin and announced that in front of them was the young man she intended to marry. A few months ago, the maids whispered hastily among themselves, knowing that they had to support the empress. They greeted the empress with joy and began to fuss around her. Navier looked at her maids with puzzlement, as she felt that the atmosphere was somehow strange. She looked at them in surprise and wondered if something had happened while she was gone. They reported that the emperor had gone hunting and brought back a stray and ordered them to take care of her. They said that they were only supposed to look after the empress, but at the same time they said that the girl looked dirty but beautiful. The girl looked at her mistress with a smile and said that there was no one more beautiful than her. At that very moment, Madame sighed heavily and said that the emperor seemed to have fallen in love with the girl. The empress looked at them in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. At the same time, they reported that he came to them and kept asking about the girl. The empress sighed heavily, as she knew that this sounded reasonable. The young lady was furious, because she knew there was definitely a spark between them. Madame looked at the lady intently and said that even if it was difficult for her to hear such things, they would still be on her side. Navier sighed heavily, because she understood that they were right, but she didn't know what to do. The ladies-in-waiting asked their mistress whether they should keep an eye on the girl. Navier smiled and said that they didn't need to do anything like that, as she knew that the emperor was simply too kind. She understood that he helped the poor girl only out of sympathy. That same evening, the empress met with the emperor and reported that she had heard that he had found the escaped slave. After she said these words, an awkward silence fell between them. The emperor sighed heavily, but did not answer. But a moment later, he asked who had told her such a thing. Navier said it didn't matter who told her about it. She wanted to know whether it was true or not. Sovishu looked intently at his wife, but did not answer. She called him insistently, as she wanted to hear the truth, but he coldly said that she did not need to rush him. Sovishu informed his wife that they only saw each other a few times a week, so they should have other things to talk about. The coldness in his voice made it clear to her that she should not interfere in this matter under any circumstances. Some time later, the young empress was resting dejectedly in her room. Her ladies-in-waiting were worried about her because they saw that she was upset. They didn't know him or the reason, but they still called her. At that very moment, they asked what the emperor had said, but Navier was unable to give them any clear answer, as he had not told her anything. They looked at each other gloomily. They were so angry at the emperor. Since they now understood why she was so gloomy, they said that she could talk to them and tell them everything. She said the emperor had reported that the woman had fallen into one of his traps, and there was no mention of her being an escaped slave. She also said that he no longer wanted to talk about it. At the same time, the maids of honor were either out of anger and rage. The young lady was furious and screamed that this was exactly how her father had behaved before starting his next affair. She was angry because she knew the first signs of an affair. She did not understand why he did not want to talk about it. Madame looked at Laura intently and asked her to wait outside for a while. A moment later, Eliza looked intently at her mistress and called her. She came closer to her and said with a smile that she would bring her some tea and it would make her feel better. Looking at the lady, she said that the emperor was struck by an amazing coincidence, and nothing more. The empress knew this, but something still made her wary. She sighed heavily and said that her mother told her not to be upset about mistresses. She realized that there had been many such cases, and she should not expect her marriage to be any different. At the same time, she did not understand why she felt so depressed. Navaire sighed heavily because she knew that she should not feel this way. Eliza hugged the empress tightly and tenderly calmed her. She looked closely at her mistress and said that she and the emperor had been together since childhood, and this was a natural emotion. At that very moment, she wondered how the emperor would feel if another man appeared next to her. She knew that every year the country freed a certain number of slaves, returning them to the status of commoners. Being a slave meant that a person was serving a life sentence for some crime he had committed, and if a slave ran away, he was considered a fugitive criminal. Navier knew that no matter how much the emperor loved the slave, she would never be able to make her debut in high society. She felt devastated because the man who had been her husband for a long time had suddenly taken a mistress. But she understood that she couldn't be emotional in this situation, and she understood that everything didn't matter because their destinies were connected. She knew that an empire could only have one empress. But at the same time, it hurt her when she heard gossip that her husband visited the slave every day. Navier sighed heavily as she realized that she had to ignore all such rumors. But still, it was very painful for her to hear something like that. A moment later, the empress was taken aback and looked in bewilderment at the girl who was glowing with happiness. She turned away, wanting to go her own way, but the young girl called out to her, but addressed her disrespectfully. At that very moment, the maids rushed to the girl and said that it was time for them to leave, and also informed her that she could not address the empress in such a way. Rashta introduced herself with a joyful smile, but the empress did not know what to do. She wondered if the girl wanted her to call her by her first name, but she knew they would have met anyway. At that very moment, she turned around as if she was about to leave, but the girl reached out to her and asked her to wait. At the same moment, she grabbed her by the hem of her dress. Eliza looked at the girl with indignation and asked how she dared to touch the empress. Rashta backed away, and Druzha said that she was very sorry, as she wanted to call the empress, but did not know how to address her. Laura informed the girl that the empress of the Eastern Empire was in front of her, and she should mind her manners. Rashta said that was not the case, and she knew that the empress was in front of her. Navier looked at her in bewilderment, because the girl knew that she was the empress, and still addressed her inappropriately. At that very moment, the girl informed the empress that the emperor had kindly allowed her to settle in the palace. Navier looked closely at the girl and asked if she was a slave. Rashta was taken aback at that moment and didn't know what to answer. The maid looked intently at the empress and said that their lady was not a slave at all. The empress was surprised as her ladies-in-waiting had told her something completely different, but she knew that it was not her problem. Rashta said with a joyful smile to the empress that they would now see each other often, and she wanted to greet her. She asked the empress how best to address her. Navier told the girl that she should call her empress. The empress turned around at that moment and wanted to leave, but the girl reached out to her again and received a slap on the arm. Laura said angrily that it was disgusting, but at that very moment, the emperor appeared at the window and angrily asked what she meant. The ladies-in-waiting quickly bowed and greeted the emperor. At that moment, the emperor glanced sideways at his wife with a cold gaze. He ignored her and hurried towards the girl. The emperor wrapped her in his cloak and asked her not to cry. Looking at the girl, the emperor sighed heavily and said that she was still the same crybaby. At that moment, the Empress felt pain in her heart, but she was no longer going to stay and watch such a scene. But at that very moment, the Emperor angrily asked her to stop, and she asked in bewilderment what had happened. The Emperor of the Terrible pointed out the maid of honor to the Empress Navier, wondered if he was really going to punish her for what she said to the slave. The Emperor sternly told his wife that she must leave her maid of honor and go away. At that very moment, she asked why she should leave hurry. Moments later, the Empress shielded her maid of honor and said firmly that she did not intend to do this. Moments later, the Emperor ordered his knights to lock up the maid of honor for several days. The maid of honor backed away, as she did not expect this, and at the same time, Rashta watched everything that was happening with a satisfied smile. The Empress could not stand it and shouted at her husband that this was too much on his part. He said angrily that her maid of honor had called the wounded woman vile. He looked at her with fury and asked if this was too much. Laura immediately shouted that she accepted the punishment. The Empress looked at her maid of honor with puzzlement. At that moment, the Emperor looked at them sullenly and announced that they could go. The Empress looked at him with fury because she understood that she would not forgive him for such a thing. A few days later, she was able to go to the tower to pick up her maid, and to atone for her guilt, she prepared a good table for her. But a moment later, she was informed that the Emperor wanted to see her. The man nervously asked the Empress for forgiveness and said that he had been ordered to escort her to the Emperor. She sighed heavily as she realized that she had no other choice, and she had to go and meet him. After some time, the young man informed the Emperor that he had brought the Empress. Navier looked closely at her husband and asked why he had called her. The Emperor looked closely at everyone present and dismissed everyone as he wanted to speak with the Empress alone. He learned that she had personally met her lady-in-waiting after the punishment and asked if she had really needed to go that far. She asked if he really wanted to know why she cared about her maid of honor, whom he had punished. The Empress said that she would not send the maid of honor away, since she had done nothing to go beyond what was permitted. She said that whether she would keep her ladies-in-waiting close by or send them away was entirely up to her. The Emperor sighed heavily as the Empress was constantly arguing with him, and he was very tired of it. He asked if she couldn't just follow his orders for once, and she angrily said that an Empress was not obligated to obey the Emperor's orders. At that very moment, he shouted angrily that that was why she could not compare. The Empress froze for a moment and wondered who she could not compare to. At that very moment, he sent her out, and sighing heavily, collapsed onto the sofa. A moment later, he rang the bell, and the young lady ran up to him with a joyful smile and asked if he had called her. He looked at her in surprise and asked with a smile when she started working for him in the palace. Rashta said that she felt like a burden and wanted to help. He asked in surprise if that was why she served him. At that very moment, the young lady also said decisively that it was so, and the Emperor found her amusing. He knew that she couldn't walk normally, but she still tried to load herself with work. He smiled and invited her to join him, as he intended to eat pumpkin pie, and she instantly became happy. He looked at her in surprise as he noticed that she was only happy with pumpkin pie. He knew that no matter what expensive jewelry he gave the Empress, she was never happy, and she was content with the girl. But now the girl in front of him was happy with a simple trifle. She asked in surprise if the Empress really didn't like jewelry, but the Emperor said that she simply didn't show her emotions. Rashta sighed and said that the Empress had a luxurious life and did not have to face the cruelty of the world. She said that no matter what jewels the Empress received, she probably did not see anything special in them. At that moment, she was taken aback and said that she did not blame the Empress. She said that people in her position usually take things for granted, and if she received a gem, it would mean nothing to her. Sophie looked at her with a satisfied smile and said that his prey was smarter than he thought. She pulled away from him embarrassed and noticed that he always called her his prey. At that moment, she said shyly that he had previously said that he would make her his concubine. Sophie said with a smile that everything would be fine as long as they took their time, and he asked her to trust him. Laura was very angry when she learned that the Emperor intended to take a concubine. The Empress assumed that her husband would make the slave his concubine, but she did not think that this would happen soon. She sighed heavily and asked her maid of honor when the girl would become a concubine. Eliza was puzzled and said that she would become a concubine until the new year. After some time, the Emperor's assistant informed the girl that after all the checks, she must put her signature. She sighed heavily and said that she didn't have her own signature. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked if she really couldn't write, but she didn't answer. He said that in today's class, they would start writing her name. He also said that the empress could give her a gift. The young man said that the empress was the mistress of the palace, and thus she could send the concubine a gift expressing her favor. Rashta was very happy and asked with a smile if she would really receive a gift from the empress. At the same time, the empress told her ladies-in-waiting that she was not going to give anything to the concubine. The ladies-in-waiting breathed a sigh of relief, as they were afraid that she would send that woman a gift. She had to send a gift if the concubine was from a noble family, and they knew each other personally, also if they belonged to the same family. She looked at everyone present with a smile and said that she was not going to give a gift, as she had no reason to do so. At that very moment, the young lady said with a smile that if her friend were next to them, she would be happy. At that very moment, she asked the empress if she had heard the latest rumors. The empress looked at her with bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. The girl said that a prince from the Western Kingdom would soon come to them, and there were rumors that he was impeccable, and one glance was enough to fall under his spell. He had many wives, but he was still single and childless. At that very moment, they asked the empress whether the prince would come to the celebration. She smiled and said that she didn't know if the rumors were true, but the prince would indeed be at the New Year's celebration. At that very moment, a servant entered their office and informed the empress that the Grand Duke had given her a beautiful silk. She sighed heavily and asked the man to return the gift back, because she was grateful that he simply thought about her. Grand Duke Liltong did not aspire to the throne, but he still craved power, and he constantly tried to bribe someone by sending gifts. She sighed heavily, because she knew he didn't know when to stop. Some time later, the young empress and her ladies-in-waiting were drinking tea, but a moment later, she was informed that the emperor's concubine wanted to see her. The empress wanted to see the girl for days, but still ordered the servants to let her in. Rashta happily greeted the empress. The empress looked at the girl intently, as she had a lot of experience in hiding her emotions in different situations. At that very moment, she congratulated the girl on becoming the emperor's concubine. The young lady happily thanked the empress, but at that very moment, the empress looked at her intently and asked why she had come to her. Rashta looked intently at the empress and said with a joyful smile that they were now sisters. Everyone was shocked. Rashta smiled and said that they now had one husband. The empress was shocked by such a statement, but at the same moment, the young lady asked with a smile if she could now call her sisters. Navier understood that this was the limit of her patience, because the girl had taken her husband away from her and now wanted to call her sister. Navier immediately coldly rejected the girl's proposal. With tears in her eyes, the young lady asked the empress why she didn't love her so much. The empress sighed heavily and said that it was not that she hated her. She said that the girl became the emperor's concubine, but she could not become her sister. The young lady was shocked. She was scared because she saw people staring at her. After some time, she became upset and muttered that the empress hated her. The young man looked at her in bewilderment because he did not understand what she was talking about. Rashta said that she became a concubine, but she cannot be the empress's sister, and it seems that she simply hates her. The baron looked closely at the young lady and asked if she had visited the empress. At that very moment, the lady said that it was so, and the baron was taken aback. He said that her position and the position of the empress were opposite to each other, but he did not know how to clearly explain this situation. She asked in bewilderment what he was talking about, since they both served the same husband. He was taken aback and asked if she had really said such things to the empress. She smiled and said that it was so. And at that very moment, the man's whole world collapsed under his feet. Some time later, the empress was sitting in the garden, in her favorite place, but she was taken aback when she saw the feather. She looked around in bewilderment and noticed a bird. Navier noticed that the bird was very beautiful, and therefore wanted to pet it. But at that very moment, the bird flew away. But a moment later, a beautiful bird landed on the empress's hand. Navier stroked the beautiful bird tenderly and thought that it had been brought to some nobles. But a moment later, she noticed a note. Unfolding the note, she saw a sweet message. The foreign guest notified that he would come for the New Year, but he also wrote a note when he was a little drunk. At that very moment, the maid of honor called the empress, but they noticed that she had a large bird sitting on her hand. They were surprised because the bird delivered a letter to her, but they also said that she should send a reply. She wrote that the bird would fly back drunk, and if of course it found the right path, it would be better than its owner. At that very moment, she attached the letter back. The young ladies were surprised that the bird only allowed the Empress to approach it. A moment later, the bird flapped its wings and flew away. The Empress looked after her with a joyful smile, as she wanted her not to get lost. At the same time, the bird flew away, with ease heading towards its owner. After some time, the young man read the sweet message with a joyful smile. He hoped that he could become smarter than the bird's owner in order to meet the Empress. Some time later, the young ladies asked the Empress if the bird had arrived to her, and they hoped that she would return with an answer. Navier said with a smile that if she doesn't get lost, she will fly back again. The Empress headed to her office, and when she opened the door, she noticed the Emperor. She looked at him in surprise and asked what brought him to her. But at that very moment, he coldly said that his concubine needed a maid of honor. Looking at his wife, he said that the noblewoman had not expressed a desire to become her ladies-in-waiting. He said that she should find the right woman herself. A moment after the emperor left, the ladies-in-waiting were hurriedly saying that she should not look for a lady-in-waiting for the concubine, since even the imperial secretary had given up. She of course didn't want to do this, and everyone understood that this was some kind of nonsense. She knew that a lady-in-waiting was usually of the same or lower rank than the noblewoman she served. The empress realized that she could not simply sit still, so she asked that an invitation be sent to all the young ladies and women in the capital. After some time, the empress gathered all the young ladies for tea. She thanked everyone with a smile for coming, as she needed their help. All the ladies looked at her in surprise, but also said that she should tell them everything. She reported that the emperor had asked her to find a lady-in-waiting, and also inquired whether there was anyone among their acquaintances who would like to be a companion for Miss Rashta. In response, the empress heard only dead silence. She was puzzled because she did not understand what had happened to the atmosphere. At that moment, the young lady asked if the emperor's concubine was one of the escaped slaves. They said that she was not even a commoner, but a slave, so they did not think that they would be able to go out into the world after something like that. After some time, the young empress hid in her room, as she was very tired after everything that had happened. The maids of honor told the empress that she needed to rest a little, but at that very moment, they saw a bird. Laura, looking at the empress, reported that the bird had returned to her. The empress quickly walked towards the bird and noticed a note on its paw. She read that the bird's owner was sober and much smarter than his charge. At that very moment, the empress laughed and asked the maid to bring her the paper. The empress wrote that she thought the bird's owner was still a little drunk, but she also asked what the bird's name was, while the ladies-in-waiting were having fun. At that very moment, the empress attached the note to the bird's leg and kissed the bird with a smile. The bird was taken aback and filled with embarrassment. A moment later, the empress sent the bird away with a smile. She didn't know if the bird would come back with an answer, but she hoped so. A moment later, the empress was informed that the emperor wanted to meet with her. The ladies-in-waiting quickly bowed and informed the empress that they would wait outside. Navier looked at him with bewilderment and said that he often comes to see her, and recently she asked what he wanted this time. He immediately asked what about his concubine. She was puzzled since he came for her again. The empress sighed heavily and said that she had called all the women she could, but no one wanted to serve her. He looked at her sullenly and asked if that was all. He said there must be some reason. At that moment, he wondered if she had said something strange at the tea party. He said that people sometimes said different things, even though they weren't sure. The empress said that people who doubt their partner cannot see beyond their noses. He looked at her and said that she should be honest with him. He asked if she had spread rumors that his concubine was an escaped slave. The emperor said that only one person benefited from spreading dirty rumors, and that applied to her. He said that the girl was now her rival, and at that moment, the empress became filled with anger. Navier said that the concubine is not a rival for her because he is not her lover, so she is not a rival. Navier angrily told the emperor not to connect her with the concubine. She asked him not to involve her in the intrigue. The emperor looked at her with fury at his trace, but did not answer. After some time, the young empress sat quietly in her secret place and was sad. She was puzzled because she knew she shouldn't cry and should be proud, but still it was hard for her. A moment later, she saw a bird feather. Looking around, she noticed the bird and happily reached out to it as it flew to her again. She read the note again and was informed that she could name the bird herself. Navier looked at the bird with a tender smile as she realized that it had guessed that she had been crying. Navier told the bird that this was her secret place where she could cry. At that moment, she was taken aback as the bird reached out to her and wiped away her tears. She smiled and pulled the bird closer to her and kissed it as the bird was comforting her, and she was grateful to it. At that very moment, she wondered what name would suit the bird, and with a smile, she wrote that from now on, she would be called Queen. She smiled and said that she would call her Queen, but the bird was a little puzzled by this name. But at that very moment, she hugged the Queen tightly and thanked her in a way that made her feel better. Navier stared at the flying bird for a while, but asked it to fly back to her again. A moment after the flight, the bird turned into a beautiful young man. The young man sighed heavily as the Empress called the man Queen. At the same moment, another bird asked him what he meant. The bird looked at the young man with displeasure and said that he was simply going to scout out the area. The young man told his friend that he was simply scouting the area and nothing more. The young man asked the prince to be a little careful and pay attention to everything that was happening. The maid looked at the young lady with a smile and informed her that everything would be fine and that the Empress would not be in this place for a while. But after some time, the young people were taken aback as the Empress came to her favorite place. Rashta quickly jumped up and called the Empress. At that very moment, the Empress looked menacingly at the girl and announced that this was her place and her chair. Rashta trembled with fear and called the Empress again. At that very moment, the Empress said menacingly that the kerchief on which she was sitting was also hers. Rashta hastily said that she did not know that he was lying there. The Empress said that she did not know about it, but should not enter the Western Palace anymore. Rashta said she would like to be friends with the Empress. The Empress said she could be friends with the next concubine. Rashta looked at the Empress in bewilderment, and she in turn said that the Emperor would bring the next concubine. That same evening, the Emperor ran in a hurry to meet his wife. The Empress looked at her husband in bewilderment and asked how she could help him. He was furious and asked his wife why people changed so much. She looked at him in bewilderment as she did not understand what he was talking about. But at that moment, he shouted that he had heard about the bad things she had said to Rashta. She sighed heavily and asked what she had said wrong. He shouted that he found out what she told her at lunch and came because it was necessary. At that moment, she asked whether the former emperor had ever spoken about his concubine to the former empress. The emperor was taken aback and froze. For a moment he said that she was also a subject of the empress before becoming his concubine. He asked if she didn't feel sorry for the girl at all, and he sighed heavily and said that he didn't know she was so cruel. A moment later, the emperor left his wife's room. The maid ran up to the empress as she saw that she was ill. That same evening, her young lady asked with a smile whether the emperor was angry with the empress because of her, and the maid confirmed her words. She was also presented with a gift from the emperor, and she happily said that they looked like lovers from a fairy tale. She was happy while the empress sadly accepted this situation. The empress sat quietly in her room, but a moment later she heard the bird fly back to her. At that very moment, the bird flew into her room and lay down on her bed. Navier said with a smile that if anyone saw the dash, they would think that she was the owner of the room. At that very moment, she read the note and was taken aback as she realized that it was a male in front of her. Days passed, and the New Year celebrations approached. The Empress was glad that she and the Emperor did not receive guests together, because thanks to this, she did not see him for some time. But a moment later, they still had to see each other and greet the prince from the Western Kingdom. She saw a handsome young man, but she knew that he was a womanizer and a very cruel person. But when the Empress saw his beauty, she was taken aback. But moments later, she froze for a second as she saw him heading straight towards her. She was struck by his radiant smile when she saw him up close. Navier understood that if he stood in the corner with his mouth closed, he could easily become the center of many rumors. At that very moment, she greeted the young prince. But moments later, she was taken aback as he knelt before her and extended his hand. She looked at him in bewilderment and extended her hand. He kissed her hand tenderly and said with a smile that it was a great honor for him to meet her. She said that she was also glad to meet him, and also asked him to rest, as she knew that the journey had been difficult. He looked at her with a smile and said that he was already satisfied, since everything was wonderful now. That same evening, standing on the balcony, she again waited for the bird. Navier reached out to the bird with a joyful smile as she was glad to see it again. At that very moment, she read a note that the bird's owner had arrived at the imperial palace. He showed off to see if she knew who he was. Navier was a little puzzled. She didn't know who the bird's owner was. But at that very moment, she wrote a note that she didn't know who he was, but asked if he knew who she was. That same evening, she sent the bird, and after some time, she patiently waited for a response. After some time, she saw her bird again, but was taken aback because it flew to her in the rain. She was shocked because the man wanted to make a bet with her, and whoever found the other first would win. She was very angry because the owner had sent the bird into such a downpour, and so she wondered if he was insensitive. But he shook his head, saying that it was not so. At the same moment, she asked what the prize was. She looked at the bird in surprise and firmly refused it. The empress said that the bird would sit in the room until the rain stopped. She said that he could stay and sleep with her, and when the rain stopped, he could go to his master. A moment later, she laid the bird down next to her in bed. Some time later, he made sure that the empress was asleep and quietly left. A moment later, he spread his wings and flew away. The next morning, the empress woke up and noticed with surprise that the bird was not nearby. But after a few minutes, she noticed that the bird was on her balcony. When she read the note, she looked at the bird in surprise, as its owner had written that the queen would be the prize. At that moment, she sighed heavily as she understood that this was very cruel, but she received a hint that the owner of the bird was a man. After some time, the empress was going about her business, but a man disturbed her. He said that the prince wanted to see her. Moments later, she came out to meet the prince. Navier looked at the prince with bewilderment, as she did not understand why he had come to her. But at that very moment, he kissed her hand with a smile and asked if he would disturb her. But at the same time, he called her queen. She quickly took her hand back and said that he would not disturb her, but asked why he had come to her. Heinley smiled and said that he had gotten lost while walking around the palace and asked if she could show him around. The empress sighed heavily and said that her maid of honor would show him everything. But at that very moment, he called her queen and said that you wanted her to show him everything. She was puzzled because he continued to call her queen, and so she wondered if he was the bird's owner. Heinley asked with a smile if that was asking too much. She saw that his voice was soft and sweet, but she felt smugness in it. At that very moment, she sighed heavily and agreed with him. She didn't want to create problems with the heir to the Western Kingdom at all, and at that very moment, the prince thanked her with a joyful smile. She asked him to follow her, but at the same time, she noticed that the atmosphere had changed dramatically. They walked slowly through the palace, and then she asked him if he had ever been to the Silver Garden. He smiled and said that he had been there, but she was taken aback because she didn't know where she could take him. At that moment, she heard a familiar voice and turned around in anger. She was puzzled because she saw her husband's concubine running towards them in a hurry. Rashta looked at them with a satisfied smile and asked if they were also walking. Rashta ran up to the prince with a joyful smile and greeted him. He bowed and greeted her in return and introduced himself. She happily shouted that he looked like a prince from a fairy tale, so she asked who he was. The empress immediately announced that in front of her was a prince from the Western Kingdom. Rashta said with a smile that she had never seen a prince. She smiled and asked if he wanted her to show him the palace. The prince thanked the girl with a smile, but said that the empress was an excellent guide. Rashta said with a joyful smile that in that case the three of them could go for a walk together. At that very moment, the prince asked the girl for forgiveness with a smile. He looked at her with a tender smile and said that 3 was too many. Rashta was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. Heinley looked at the empress with a smile and invited her to continue their tour. The empress looked at the prince with bewilderment as she noticed that he was surprisingly very cold. A few minutes into their walk, he called her. The prince looked intently at the empress and asked if she found him handsome. He sighed heavily and said that it was very strange because people were usually interested in him. He did not understand why the queen was so cold towards him. He asked if his face was swollen. Heinley looked closely at the empress, but at the same time he said with puzzlement that he even dressed up. She sighed heavily and said that it was not so, and he was very handsome. Heinley apologized with a smile, as she had a very sad face some time ago. At that very moment, he asked who the woman was that they had encountered recently. He asked if she was the emperor's mistress. At that moment, he sighed heavily and said that the emperor was a very strange man. He did not understand how he could look for someone when he had such a wife with him. The empress did not answer his question, but asked if he had received an invitation to the banquet. He sighed heavily and said that he had received it, but the invitation was from the emperor of the Eastern Empire. He sighed heavily and asked why she didn't cross out the emperor's name and write her own name below. Heinley extended his hand to the empress with a gentle smile and asked if she wanted to continue their walk. After some time, the empress looked with a tender smile at the small notes that the bird brought her. But a moment later, she was taken aback as she noticed a bird on her balcony. She smiled and asked if he didn't look at her, because he was ashamed she noticed that he was a very good gentleman. Navier looked at the bird with a tender smile, as she hoped that she would be able to meet its owner. Some time later, the emperor and empress held a ball online in honor of the first day of the holiday, the New Year. The empress in turn shone with beauty, but at the same time she had very sad eyes. She looked around in bewilderment and was taken aback as she saw a concubine at the event. It was not that concubines could not attend ceremonies, but when they did, they were usually of noble status. At that moment, the emperor turned away from his wife and called his concubine. He looked at her with a tender smile and asked if she had been waiting for him for a long time. The empress was depressed and found it difficult to look at such a thing. She immediately turned away and left. A moment later, she greeted the duchess. The duchess greeted the empress with a smile and said that the holiday was wonderful. At that moment, everyone was taken aback as they noticed that the prince had arrived, and they quickly began to whisper about him because they wanted to know if he was currently dating anyone, since they knew all the rumors about him. After some time, the empress stood quietly and sipped wine. But a moment later, she was taken aback as she saw the prince in the reflection of the glass. The prince looked at the empress with a smile and greeted her. But a moment later, it was taken aback as it heard that even she, the callous empress, could not remain indifferent to such a handsome man. At that moment, they were taken aback by the way she looked at them intently. She was furious because they were talking about her. A moment later, her young lady approached her and asked if she had really sent a gift to the concubine. Navier looked at her in bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. The lady asked for forgiveness, as she simply heard that the woman was talking about this, because she said that after she became a concubine, the empress sent her a gift. The empress smiled and said that the young lady had misunderstood something. The lovely ladies were happy about this, but at that very moment they noticed that the dancing had begun. The empress turned around as she realized that the stations had begun, and she and the emperor were supposed to open the ball. She looked closely at her husband, as she knew that he would dance with the concubine. Navier knew that the only person who could ask the empress for the first dance was the emperor. She knew no one would ask her to dance, so she could just relax. But at that very moment, she was taken aback as the prince approached her and presented her with a flower and also asked if she danced well. She was shocked because he invited the empress to the first dance, but she wondered if this would lead to rumors. But she still accepted the invitation and asked if he could be a worthy partner. He smiled and said that if she stepped on his foot a few times, he would just ignore it. As she walked to the dance floor, she caught the emperor's eye. At that moment, the prince smiled and told the empress that she had finally noticed him, and she asked in bewilderment what he was talking about. Heinley said with a smile that she hadn't paid much attention to him yesterday and that he had dressed better today. While dancing, he said with a smile that he knew better than anyone that unnecessary rumors spread at the speed of light. The empress asked if he was talking about the rumors that she had sent the concubine a greeting gift. Navier smiled and said that she was grateful to him, and in return, she would not believe the rumors that he was a womanizer. The prince was taken aback as he did not expect such a thing, but at the same moment he laughed. He looked at her with a smile and said that these rumors were not true. A moment later, it was time to change partners, and the young concubine happily said that she wanted to dance with the prince. The empress was taken aback as she had completely forgotten that they could not dance with one person several times in a row. A moment later, she was dancing with her husband. She knew that they had been dance partners since childhood, but now she clearly felt the coldness between them and was not happy with this kind of dance. She remembered how they laughed at their clumsy movements. Navier remembered how he consoled her every time he stepped on her foot. But now, Navier understood that all this remained only in her memories. At that very moment, the emperor called his wife. He looked at her coldly and said that he had a concubine, so he did not forbid her to have a lover, but it should not be a prince. She was shocked because she didn't expect him to say something like that. He looked at her and said that it was a shame to become a concubine of a prince of another country while being an empress. At that very moment, the empress said that she and the prince did not have such a relationship, but the emperor did not pay attention to her words and immediately rushed to the concubine. Rashta burst into tears in the emperor's arms because the prince said he did not want to dance with her. Navier froze in place as she heard what they were saying about her, and that the emperor had abandoned her. She did not listen to such things and left the hall at that very moment, but moments later she bumped into the prince. Looking away from her, he said that he was afraid that she would get lost in such a large palace. Heinley looked at the empress and asked if she was okay. The empress said with a smile that everything was fine, but thanked him for seeing her off. A moment later, she stepped into her room and closed the door. At that very moment, she quietly slid to the floor and burst into tears. But not even a few minutes had passed when she heard the bird fly towards her. Navier looked at the bird with a smile, as it always flew to her when she was sad. Navier hugged the bird with a smile, as sometimes it seemed to her that it really was a person. At that very moment, Eliza informed the empress that an envoy from the Verdi estate had arrived. Eliza announced that the viscountess could no longer serve as the empress's maid of honor. The empress thought for a moment, as the viscountess had recently borrowed money from her. She didn't know what had happened, but she hoped she was okay. The next day, the empress and her ladies-in-waiting noticed that the concubine was wearing a blue silk dress. They knew that the Grand Duke was trying to give this outfit to the empress. At that very moment, they noticed a familiar man next to the concubine. The empress knew that next to the concubine was the very same viscountess who refused to serve her. Navier was furious as she realized that the concubine was trying to take away everything that belonged to her. At that very moment, the princess of the southern kingdom said that she did not understand the system of concubines and that it was treason. But at that very moment, she said with a smile that she had heard an interesting story in the southern palace today. She said with a smile that the prince had been exchanging anonymous letters with someone, and they said that he wanted to find that person. At that very moment, the ladies-in-waiting looked intently at their empress, for they, the scoundrels, had seen something similar. She smiled and said that if she revealed her name, her enemies might use the information against her. Therefore, the empress wanted to remain his nameless friend. That same evening, Rashta, along with her maids, discussed a romantic story about a prince who was looking for a man by correspondence. The ladies-in-waiting said that their lady most likely corresponded with the prince. Rashta said with a smile that she was also curious about who it could be. After some time, she looked at the viscountess with puzzlement and asked if she was ill or if she wanted to return to the empress. At that very moment, the viscountess said that the person the prince was looking for was the empress. The girl was taken aback, as she did not expect such a thing. The viscountess said that the empress would not reveal herself because she was too proud. Rashta asked if the viscountess knew what they had been corresponding about, and at that moment, she said that she had an idea. The next day, the empress looked at everyone present with bewilderment as she heard something suspicious. Navier heard that they had found the girl who had been corresponding with the prince. Looking at the young lady, the empress realized that the girl was from the concubine's entourage. Cheerily looked at the prince with embarrassment and introduced herself, and also said that he had been corresponding with hers. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was the one with whom he had exchanged letters. At that moment, he asked if it was true. She smiled and said that it was. Heinley approached the girl and said that the person he was looking for was very dear to him, and he would be glad if she turned out to be his pen pal. But he also said that if it wasn't so, he would be very disappointed and just didn't know what he could do with her. He asked if she was sure of her words. The girl backed away, as she hoped that everything would be fine. She remembered how the concubine had begged her to pretend that she was the girl with whom the prince had been corresponding. She knew that everything would be fine, since Lady Rashta told her to do something like that. However, the empress paid attention to the prince and his companion. The prince looked at the girl in surprise and asked why she had lied to him, since he had made it clear that the person in question was dear to him. At that very moment, the girl began to tremble and said that this was not so. He looked at her closely and said that there was some truth in what she said, but he knew that she had not written him a letter. But he realized that she knew their contents, and he inquired about the man she served. He glanced sideways at the Empress and asked the girl if her mistress had learned the contents of the letters from somewhere. Rashta immediately told the prince with a smile that he was very perceptive, but at the same time, she thought that he was just fooling around when they exchanged letters. He looked at the lady in surprise and asked if the girl really served her. She immediately said with a smile that everything was correct and that she was the one he was looking for. And at the same time, she said that he could check her. Navier froze in shock, as she had not expected this. The prince looked at the girl with a fierce grin and said with a smile that there was no need for this, because he believed that she would not become a logo for him. That same evening, the maids of honor were indignant and did not understand why the concubine had lied. Navier looked at the girls with a smile and said that the prince knew that the concubine was lying, so they should not be upset. But she was still puzzled, because she understood that he had deliberately allowed himself to be deceived, but she did not understand why he would do something like that. Navier sighed heavily, as her bird had not appeared for several days. Eliza smiled and told the Empress not to worry. And besides, it was time for her to get ready. The Empress thanked Madame with a smile for her help. She was getting ready for the last day of the New Year holidays, and she also had to attend a dinner for guests. The Empress knew that the most distinguished guests would be the Prince and the Grand Duke. While the Prince was always surrounded by various rumors, the Prince was the only guest from another continent. She walked slowly into the hall, when suddenly she was taken aback, as the concubine again addressed her as a sister. The Empress was puzzled as she did not like all this. She looked at the concubine in bewilderment, as she knew that she should not be at the banquet. At that moment, the Empress decided to ignore the concubine and went to her place. The princess looked intently at the Empress and said with a smile that she was glad to see her, as the atmosphere was tense. The princess told the Empress that she believed the rumors that the prince was a womanizer, since he had been affectionately communicating with the emperor's concubine. She also said that the prince looked like custard. The Empress was taken aback, as she did not expect such a thing. After the princess's words, she looked around closely, as she realized that the atmosphere was quite tense. The Empress understood that something was wrong, but she did not know what exactly. At that moment, the Emperor angrily shouted at the prince that he was being very rude. The prince smiled and said that he had noticed the obvious, because Rashta could not answer letters without knowing their contents. He said that if she pretended to be the girl he was looking for, she should expect him to defend her honor. He said that in such a situation, he feels betrayed. The Emperor shouted that the girl was simply confused, and the content could be confusing. The prince sighed heavily and asked whether it made sense to submit half of the contents of the letters. He said he did not believe such a thing, because he thought the lady could not lie. He said with a smile that, as the princess put it, he was as soft as human custard. The ladies were taken aback, as they realized that he had amazing hearing. Rashta burst into tears and asked if he behaved this way, because she was of low class, and he considered her disgusting. The Empress looked at everyone present in bewilderment, as she did not understand what the girl was trying to achieve. She didn't know whether she should intervene, but at that very moment, she felt the Grand Duke's gaze on her. But a moment later, as their eyes met, he looked away. The Empress looked at the prince in bewilderment, as she did not understand what was wrong with him. Navier sighed as she didn't care. At the same moment, she said that she didn't want to get involved in their quarrel, but there was a misunderstanding and she had to fix it. She said that she knew the person with whom the prince exchanged letters, and it was not his concubine. The emperor was puzzled because he knew that she did not love the concubine. He said that this did not mean that she should side with the prince. The prince smiled and said that the emperor believed the words of his concubine. He knew that this was unpleasant for the empress, but at that very moment, the emperor shouted at the prince and told him to shut up, but at the same time he drew his sword. The emperor angrily told the prince that he was challenging him to a duel in order to defend the honor of Lady Rashita. Heinley asked the emperor if he killed him, would he be able to escape unharmed? The emperor hesitated for a moment, not knowing what to answer. He looked at the emperor with a grin and said that if that was the case, he would accept his challenge to a duel. Navier sighed heavily, as she understood that the palace was now in complete chaos. At that very moment, she asked the emperor to calm down. She also turned to the prince and asked him to calm down. She knew that even though he was their guest, he should not have behaved like this. She looked at them intently and said that they both had to stop immediately. At that moment, she thanked them for their visit and said that she would finish their meal with that. Navier in turn slowly left the hall. At that very moment, the princess caught up with her and said that they should meet tomorrow and talk in a favorable environment. The empress looked at the princess with a smile and thanked her for coming to the evening. At that very moment, Rashta ran out to them and with a smile told the princess that she should come to her tomorrow and also thanked the princess for coming tonight. Rashta looked at the empress with bewilderment and asked if something was wrong, and she again called her sister. Rashta asked the prince with a smile whether he would be at the special questionnaire tomorrow. The empress was taken aback and noticed that the concubine had bought her. The prince looked at her in bewilderment but did not answer. A moment later, he left silently, and the lovely ladies stared after him. The empress looked closely at the girl and asked why she had lied to everyone and said that she had sent her a gift. Rashta said that she had not lied, and it was true that the empress had sent her many gifts. The empress said that she did nothing. The concubine said that she just wanted to help the empress because she did not want to admit publicly that she was a pen pal. At that very moment, she burst into tears again and asked the empress why she was so cruel to her. The emperor asked what had happened again. The empress said that she asked why the concubine had lied about the gifts. The emperor sighed heavily and said that it was he who had sent the gifts to the concubine on her behalf. He asked the girl for forgiveness for the misunderstanding that happened because of him. Rashta told the emperor that she was happy that he did this for her sake. At that very moment, the empress told the emperor that he must take all the blame because no matter the circumstances, he should not have used her name. He looked at her intently and asked what she wanted. The empress said she wanted him to apologize and deny the rumors. She said that he easily blackened her name, and at the same time, he should take care of reporting the situation as soon as possible. He asked angrily if she had always been so petty. Navier, looking at the emperor, said that she had to tell him this. She told him to speak to her politely. The prince looked closely at the empress as he saw that she was holding back her emotions. He was a little surprised because she could be cold. At that very moment, the emperor asked the empress if she was jealous of his concubine. The prince was taken aback, as he had not expected to hear such a thing. But at that very moment, the prince told the emperor that he must be more discerning. At that moment, the prince told the empress with a smile that she did not need to worry, as he would refute the rumors, and her reputation would not be tarnished by the mistake. The emperor looked at the prince with anger, as he did not like his words. At that very moment, the young man called out to the prince, but at the same time he was rushing towards him at full speed. A moment later, he took the prince with lightning speed and announced that they had urgent business. The young man looked at the prince with anger and said that he had previously said that he would take care of his reputation. He told the prince that he should do everything as usual. He kept telling the prince that he must fight even from the shadows. He did not understand why his opponent had to be the Emperor of the East. He shouted that in that case their spies would be exposed. At that moment, the prince reached out to his comrade and told him not to move. Using his magic, he turned him into a bird and told him to deliver the letter. The young man was puzzled, but still knew that he had no choice. The prince looked at his comrade with a smile and said that he was not going to get into trouble, and therefore he could fly away. After some time, the empress told her faithful friends about this situation. Laura sighed heavily and said that she was very glad that the prince had exposed their lie, but she wondered if the nobles would understand what kind of woman he had been talking to. Artina said that they would not understand anything, and also reported that the baron was responsible for the concubine's affairs, and that he had spread other rumors about her. She said that because of the young lady's beauty and charm, some said that the emperor and prince were fighting over her. At that moment, Laura flared up, and one screamed that she hated the baron because of such words. At that very moment, all the empress's sorrows disappeared as she saw her bird. Navier hugged the bird tightly as she missed it since they had not seen each other for a long time. At that very moment, she saw the message. The prince said that his identity was on the canoe and asked why she did not want to participate in the bet. The empress sighed heavily, not knowing what to answer him, but a moment later she wrote that they were only pen pals. She assured the bird that her owner was very good. Looking at the bird, she said that if they met, they would be prince and empress, not friends, while she became the center of gossip because of the emperor and concubine. She did not want the circumstances to worsen at all, because she understood that this would reflect badly on the prince's reputation. After some time, the emperor informed his concubine that she could not attend the special banquet. He said there was already a guest list, but she said they could add one person. The emperor said tenderly that then the banquet would no longer be special. Rashta said that everyone would come to the banquet, and he should have invited hers. Rashta had told the emperor that she was his concubine, so it would be strange to ask something so obvious. She wanted him to take her, but the emperor only apologized to her and asked her not to cry. Embracing her, he sighed heavily and said that he would try to ask the empress to find a place for her. Some time later, he met the empress, and she asked in surprise whether he had invited her because of the special banquet. Rashta froze at that very moment and looked with admiration at the empress's crown. The emperor asked if she could free up a seat. Navair asked if the Holy Father or the chief mage would be able to attend. She knew she had no choice but to ask someone to give up their seat. The emperor immediately said that this was not so, and he simply wanted to take the concubine with him. The empress refused him, and also said that even if the Holy Father needed the seat, it would be very difficult to ask anyone to give up the seat. She also said that he should do it himself if it was his mistress. She didn't understand why he called her. At that moment, she turned away and walked towards the door. The empress visited the Red Rose Hall, where a special banquet was to be held. She looked at everyone present, and her gaze stopped on the Grand Duke. At that very moment, she asked him if he liked the food. She noticed that this time, he did not ignore her. At that moment, he sighed heavily and wondered if this was really the Eastern Empire. The empress asked him in bewilderment what he was talking about. The Grand Duke said that in his homeland, the king and queen are one, and if the queen sees the king's mistress, she will kill her on the spot. The empress smiled and said that in the Eastern Empire, the emperor would not allow the empress to kill people without reason, and there must be a trial first. He sighed heavily because he knew it was very stupid that she couldn't eat soup from her own bowl. The empress looked at him with bewilderment, wondering if he really meant yesterday when she had failed to properly take care of her concubine. She sighed heavily because she did not understand why she was so pathetic if the emperor made her a concubine. At that moment, she turned around because she saw the prince at the banquet. He said that he would like to discuss something with her, but at the same time, the prince himself hesitated, not knowing how to start the conversation. At that very moment, he looked at her and said that he had read the letter, and also asked if she really wanted to keep their friendship solely in the form of correspondence. She asked in surprise if he knew that she was from the ruler. Heinle smiled and told her not to worry, because he knew she was right. Heinle said with a smile that Lady Charon and Lady Rashta knew the contents of only the early letters. Then he thought that someone knew about the letters, and that someone told the ladies about the contents. Heinle sighed heavily and said that, after a little investigation, he found out that one of the empress's maids of honor had recently been transferred to the concubine. She looked at him in surprise as he realized something like this, because of one little thing. Navier asked the prince if he was okay. As he did not look happy, he sighed heavily and said that the man he considered his friend was pretending not to know anything. He was very sad because he didn't really have many friends to talk to. Heinle said that because of his popularity, he is always surrounded by people, so he is not alone in the usual sense of the word. But as the prince of a Western kingdom and the heir to the throne of a powerful nation, he could not be completely frank with other people. He looked intently at the empress and said that he must always remember his position and reputation. Heinle said with a smile that was why he was glad when he finally had a friend with whom he could be himself. The empress said with a smile that she understood him, and although these were only letters, she was very pleased. At that moment, he smiled and whispered that she could say that her husband was a real piece of trash. At that moment, she laughed. Heinle smiled and told the empress that he understood everything and would keep their friendship a secret, but as compensation, she should not ignore him. At the same time, in the banquet hall, everyone was praising the young lady as they envied her silver hair and black eyes. She watched everything that was happening with joy, but noticed that neither the empress nor the duchess were there. She understood that now was her time to shine with beauty in high society. She knew that beauty could be poisonous, Rashta said with a smile that she thought it would be better to invite guests who could benefit the empire for a special banquet. The ladies looked at her with admiration as they understood that she was intelligent. They noticed that the previous emperor had many concubines, but none of them were interested in politics. She said with a smile that this was so, and she should help the emperor. She was pleased because she understood that she had become a real lady in the hall. She understood that no one could harm her. But at that very moment she was taken aback and dropped her glass of wine as she saw a man whom she did not expect to see at this event. She froze in shock and looked at the man, wondering why he was in a place like this. Rashta looked at the man, trembling, frozen for a moment in shock. The young man asked her, puzzled, if everything was okay, but she said that she had drunk too much and needed to rest. But a moment later, she was taken aback and froze in place as she heard a man's voice. Rashta turned around timidly, and the man mockingly said that she was enjoying life. Rashta, in turn, looked fearfully into the Viscount's eyes. He mockingly asked if they were really treating the runaway slave like a lady now. At the same time, the prince was having a casual conversation with the girl. She assured the prince not to be upset, because he could not find the person through correspondence. But in turn, the prince looked at the empress with a satisfied smile, since he had already found his correspondence partner. At the same time, the empress turned around as she heard some kind of rumble. She looked at the captain of the imperial guard with bewilderment. The captain informed the emperor that his presence was required in the main hall. The emperor asked what had happened, but the captain could not answer him, and the emperor decided to immediately follow him to the main hall. The empress looked at the men in bewilderment, as she did not know what was going on. She understood that if something important had happened, she would have been called, so she assumed that something had happened to the concubine. She walked slowly into the main hall, wanting to check on the other guests and meet Laura. But after a moment, she froze and looked around in confusion, as she did not understand what was wrong with the atmosphere. Laura ran hurriedly to her mistress and asked if she had heard the latest news. The empress looked at the young lady with bewilderment, as she said that something very interesting had happened. The empress said she would not listen to anything, but her lady-in-waiting asked her if she remembered the rumor that the concubine was an escaped slave. The empress said that she remembered it, but they could not talk about it. But at that moment, the maid said that the concubine was indeed an escaped slave. She reported that the Viscount recognized Rashta, and it turned out that she was his slave, and then ran away. The emperor was away, so no one protected the girl, and the Viscount was only in the capital for a few hours, so he did not know about the emperor's order. Navir sighed heavily, as she knew that her husband now knew the truth. But she knew that he would still love the concubine. But she was still interested in what would happen next. But she knew one thing: she did not want to get involved in such disputes. Sometime later, she visited the emperor and concubine. There was an awkward silence between the spouses. The emperor looked closely at his wife and asked if she wanted to tell him anything. The empress asked why he had called her. She sighed heavily and said that she knew he was upset, but he should not take out his anger and frustration on her. The emperor said that she was born a noblewoman, and she had a good family, a huge fortune, great power, a beautiful mansion, natural intelligence, and beauty. He also said that Rashta had nothing, but at the same time she liked the empress was smart and beautiful, but she had no opportunities. The empress told her husband that the girl was his concubine, so he should take care of her. The emperor said that she wanted to prove that the concubine was an escaped slave, and that was why she brought the Viscount. He knew that it was she who sent out the invitations. The empress looked at her husband in bewilderment and said that all the invitations had been sent before the concubine's arrival. He was furious and shouted that she could have rescinded the invitation. Navir said that he should have done so. He shouted at her that she was simply a terrible and heartless woman, but the empress did not want to listen to him anymore and slowly left the room. But moments later, she was taken aback as she heard a familiar voice. Navir looked at the prince in surprise and asked if he had decided to take a little walk. At that very moment, the prince reached out to the empress. But after a moment, he stopped and asked, puzzled, if the emperor had insulted her again. He sighed heavily and said that he should have been the one to meet her first. The prince was puzzled. He did not understand why he had not been born a few years earlier. At that moment, he sheepishly asked if he should send the queen to her for consolation. Navir happily asked if he knew where he was now. The prince said with a smile that he knew where the queen was now, and that he would send him to her room. She said that they could go to him together, as she had many questions. At that moment, the prince was taken aback, as he did not know what to do in this situation. At the same time, the Viscount looked at the emperor with bewilderment. He did not understand why he was now kneeling before him. He understood that he could not stoop so low because the emperor was hardly older than his son, so he was very angry. At that very moment, the emperor told the Viscount to explain the incident. The Viscount was a little puzzled, as he knew that the emperor knew everything, but now he asked for an explanation. He understood that he could turn the situation to his advantage. At that very moment, he asked the emperor for forgiveness, as he often confused faces. He said that he mistook the lady for the missing slave, because she also had light hair and dark eyes. The Viscount asked the emperor to forgive the sick man. The emperor sighed heavily and said that he would forgive him, but he should watch his language. The Viscount looked at the emperor with a grin, because he understood that he liked the slave. He immediately promised that he would watch his words. The prince looked away from the empress in confusion, not knowing what to do in this situation. The empress looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand why he was in the way. Heinle said timidly that his pet was very shy. Navier understood that it was awkward for them to walk together at such a time. At that very moment, she asked for forgiveness, since it was very reckless on her part. Heinle smiled and asked what she wanted to know about his pet. Navier asked what the queen liked. At that moment, the prince looked away from her in embarrassment and said that the queen liked her. Navier noticed that it was very difficult for him to talk about feelings. She smiled and thanked him for the information, but she was asking about something completely different. She asked what kind of food the queen liked. He promised not knowing what to answer. At that very moment, he said that the queen would eat everything she offered him. As he left, he smiled and said that the queen would fly to her soon. A moment later, the empress prepared a treat for the queen. Earlier, the empress asked what the birds liked, and the captain of the knights said that the birds liked insects, and she also said that she could bring food. After some time, the empress looked at the queen with joy. At that very moment, he landed on the empress. The empress looked closely at the beautiful bird, as she knew that he needed to eat insects. At that very moment, she smiled and said that she had something interesting for him. He beamed with happiness, and the empress said with a smile that she had prepared a whole feast for such a large bird. She handed him the wonderful treat with a joyful smile, but at that very moment, he was taken aback. A moment later, he flew away from the empress with tears in his eyes. The empress looked after him with bewilderment, and at the same time, she thought that he didn't like insects. After some time, she met the prince. At that moment, the prince ran up to the empress and informed her that he had answered her incorrectly. He said that his pet does not eat raw food. The empress smiled and said that she could give him the cooked larvae, but the prince was taken aback and said that he didn't eat insects at all. That same evening, the young lady lay quietly in her bed, glad that the emperor protected her. Rashta knew that people had finally noticed her, but she also understood that everything was destroyed in an instant. At that very moment, the maid approached the concubine and informed her that the Viscount had come to visit her. Rashta was puzzled and didn't know what to do. She was afraid that everyone would find out the truth. She did not understand why the emperor did not kill the Viscount or put him in prison. The maid told the young lady that the Viscount had said that if she did not let him in, she would regret it. Rashta angrily told her maid of honor that she must let the Viscount go, as she wanted to look into his shameless face. After some time, the Viscount entered the room to see the hostage and was taken aback as he saw luxurious apartments. Rashta looked menacingly at the man and asked why he had come to see her. At that very moment, the Viscount said mockingly that she had already become a real lady. Rashta told the Viscount that he would not treat her as a slave. He thought for a moment, because he knew it was true. He looked at her intently and said that he had been ordered to keep silent about her origins. At that very moment, a squabble broke out between them. The Viscount looked at her with a grin and said that he had not told her anything about the child she had abandoned. Rashta was shocked and screamed in rage that he had killed her child. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked her with a grin what she meant. The Viscount said that, even though the child had plebeian blood, he was still his grandson and he would not kill his grandson. She screamed that it was all a lie, since she had seen the child's body with her own eyes. At that moment, he said with a grin that she should understand that he could be her hands and ears. She pushed him away, but he immediately asked how long she would be the emperor's favorite. He said that she had already met his son, and now she was in a similar situation. He told her that the more the emperor loved her, the more women would begin to follow her example. Poor but beautiful women would begin to seduce the emperor. He said that people who were looking for political gain would send the temperatures of women of higher status and education. The Viscount said that she was not an empress, and when the emperor fell out of love with her, she would become a slave again. Rashta was taken aback and trembled with fear, as she did not want to become a slave again. At that moment, the Viscount hugged her and said that he could help her, but first she had to trust him and think everything through carefully. Navier looked at the prince in bewilderment, as she did not know what his pet liked. The prince looked at the empress and said that she could simply pet the bird and free it enough. He asked her for forgiveness, as the birds of the Western Kingdom were quite picky. She realized that he didn't like it when other people fed the bird, so she reassured him and told him that she had heard that pets only eat what their owners give them. The young man looked away to the side and said that it was not about that, but he still asked her for forgiveness. He sighed heavily and reported that the queen had certain restrictions on travel. At that moment, he looked intently at the empress and said that she would soon have a birthday. She was surprised that he knew about her birthday, but he smiled and said that he was a close friend of the empress. At that very moment, the emperor approached them and asked the prince how long he intended to remain in the empire. The prince smiled and said that he would be in the empire for about a month. The emperor said that it was too long, as he had heard that the king was in poor health. The prince smiled and thanked the emperor for his concern. Navier looked closely at the young people, as she saw that the situation was not very pleasant. At that very moment, she sighed heavily and announced that it was time for her to leave. The emperor looked intently at his wife and asked her to stop. He came closer to her and said that he needed to talk to her alone. Heinley glanced sideways at the empress, as he did not want her to leave with the emperor. The emperor looked at her intently and asked why the prince was looking at the empress with such an unhappy expression on his face. Heinley said that it was all because the empress accompanied him during the walk, and he was going to take her away. At that very moment, the emperor took the empress and informed her that she was not the prince's companion at all, but his wife. The emperor sighed and told the empress that the prince was indeed as sweet as a pet dog, but she must understand that their intimacy would lead to a scandal. He wondered what would happen to the honor of the Eastern Empire if the empress herself were seduced by some womanizer. She sighed heavily and said that ordinary conversation could not tarnish the honor of the empire. Navier said that, because of his concubine, he wanted to drive the prince away. The emperor said that she hated the concubine, so she used her name as a shield. As she left, the empress said that she did not intend to listen to his such conversations. At that moment, the emperor looked at his wife and said that he had been somewhat rude earlier. The empress stopped. He said that he should not have blamed her for what happened to the Viscount. The emperor timidly said that he was angry and could not think clearly, and therefore he asked for forgiveness. She sighed heavily and looked at him with a smile, but still wondered if it had taken him several days to realize this. A moment later, the emperor said that his wife had a birthday soon, so he suggested going to the villa to rest and make peace. Navier knew she had to show all the nobles, subjects, and enemies of the empire that the emperor and empress had an excellent relationship. She understood that for the stability of the empire, she needed to appear strong even if her husband loved other women. She knew it, but it still hurt her a lot. But despite all this, she agreed with a smile. The emperor in turn breathed a sigh of relief. At the same moment, he asked if she had spoken to the Grand Duke. The emperor announced that he wanted to establish diplomatic relations between Rupt and the continent of Wills. The officials' opinions on the benefits of this cooperation were divided. Rupt attracted people with its exoticism, but the climate and weather on the continents varied significantly, and they were also far from each other. The empress knew that if she tried to establish only international trade, these relations would simply waste the empire's treasury. The emperor reported that the prince studied at the Academy of the territory of the Eastern Empire. He spent many years in the empire, and therefore the emperor did not want to lose the chance to develop new relations. The emperor looked intently at his wife and said that the Grand Duke had informed him that if they agreed to diplomatic relations, the empress should take direct part in this. Navier informed the emperor that the prince was a very important person for international relations, so there was no reason at all to reject his request. As he left, the emperor said that if she agreed, they would meet at the next meeting. For some time, the empress stared at the emperor and wondered whether he really wanted to go to the villa. Navier was puzzled, as she knew that last time the concubine had persuaded her to take her to a special banquet. She didn't know how to behave if her husband took his concubine with him to the villa. Navier sighed heavily, as she understood that most likely he would take her, and they would not be alone, but three at the villa. At that very moment, she was taken aback, because she saw the prince. Navier looked at him in surprise. He smiled and greeted the empress again. The empress was surprised that he was still in the garden. He said with a smile that he thought she might return, so he was waiting for her. Heinley said with a smile that he thought it would be better to sit still than to go to the palace and get lost there. Navier asked in surprise if he really didn't know the way back. He smiled and said that it wasn't so. But at that very moment, he accepted the empress's handkerchief with a smile. A moment later, he hid it, and the empress, surprised, reached for the handkerchief. Heinley smiled and said that he would wash it and return it so that they could meet again. The empress looked at him puzzled and again mentioned her birthday. She said she didn't think they could have lunch together. He was surprised. She then reported that the emperor had invited her to go to the villa, and she said that she was very sorry, but he assured her that she did not need to worry. Heinley looked at the empress with a gentle smile and said that he did not want to put pressure on her. After some time, the young man sighed heavily, and looking at the prince, said that it looked like he was going to put pressure on her. He did not understand why the prince chose the ring. The prince said that the empress would soon have a birthday. The young man was puzzled and said that there was no significant gap between the states, so they did not need to bribe the empress. At that moment, he looked in surprise at the handkerchief that the prince had Heinley said, with a smile, that it was a precious handkerchief. He transformed himself and looked at his subordinate with a smile. The young man asked in surprise if the prince really wanted him to tie up his scarf. He was puzzled, as he understood that this situation was very complicated, but at the same moment he was taken aback as he saw the letter on the tent and understood who the prince's pen friend was. At the same time, the empress was reading books in the library, but a moment later, she saw the queen with her handkerchief. She kissed Bird with a smile, as she noticed that he looked great with the scarf around his neck. At that moment, the empress said with a smile that he smelled just like the prince. He was taken aback and flew out the window in embarrassment. A few minutes later, he flew to his room and transformed, but he was confused as he did not understand how the empress could say such a thing. Heinley recalled her hugging him tenderly. He was very embarrassed and couldn't help himself. The young man at the same time told the prince that he should cover himself because his appearance was embarrassing. But a moment later, he asked the prince if the person he had met to give the handkerchief to was really the empress. Heinley looked away and said nothing, but the young man persistently asked the prince not to evade the answer. Catching up with the prince, he shouted that he should not get involved with the imperialists of the other side, as he could start a conflict with the Eastern Empire. At that very moment, he asked the prince if their feelings were mutual. Heinley didn't answer and froze for a moment. He looked intently at the concubine, who kept her gaze fixed on him. But at that very moment, he, ignoring her, passed by Rashta. At that very moment, called the prince. He looked at her sideways and asked what she wanted. She looked at him intently and asked if he had nothing to say to her. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked why she called him. He asked if she had nothing to tell him. At that moment, the young lady looked at him with tears in her eyes. The young man looked intently at his master, because he knew that the emperor's favorite was in front of him, and he hoped that his master would control his facial expressions. A moment later, the young lady's expression changed, and with a smile, she told the prince that he was a wonderful man. The young man looked at the concubine in bewilderment, as he did not understand what she was saying at all. The prince in turn also looked at the concubine with bewilderment, since he did not understand what she was saying. She smiled and asked for forgiveness. She also said that he must be upset because of her tears. She said that after rumors spread that she was a runaway slave, people began to treat her badly. Rashta noticed that the prince behaved as before. She understood that although their relationship could not be called good, she was still touched. The young man looked at the concubine in bewilderment. He did not know how much she had been bullied that the prince's behavior had touched her. Heinley sighed heavily and looked at the time. At that very moment, he turned around and said that if this was all on her part, then he had to leave. The young man was taken aback and asked the concubine for forgiveness as his master had behaved rudely. He asked if he was being too cold to the girl, and Heinley asked, puzzled, if he really wanted him to be kind to someone who had deceived him and made him look like a fool. After some time, Laura asked the Empress if she knew with whom the Duke had spent the whole day. The Empress knew that the Duke was known to be a close friend of the prince, but at that very moment, Laura said that he had spent time with the concubine. She said that during their walk, they accidentally met a nobleman who began to mock the concubine because she was a runaway and a slave, and then the Duke hit him. After some time, the young lady thanked the Duke with a smile for protecting her. She said that she felt very uncomfortable because false rumors were being spread about her. LG Claudia asked the young lady if this happened often. Rashta sighed heavily but did not answer. Her silent answer irritated the Duke. He was furious that they were telling her to her face that she was a slave. He shouted that he should deal with her offenders. He sighed heavily and said that he had come to the palace to see a friend, but luckily he had met her. He was glad that he had stood up to the young man and defended her honor, but he also knew that his friend was very angry because he had not visited him. LG Claudia told the girl that he hoped something like this would never happen again, but at the same time, he advised her to deal with the offenders as soon as possible. She sighed heavily and said that the Viscount himself had denied the rumors, but no one believed him. The Duke said that she should entrust this matter to someone else. He said with a grin that she could simply hand over the victim's place to someone else. When the Empress woke up, she noticed that there was a letter on her windowsill. She knew that on the agenda was a meeting to discuss diplomatic issues in connection with relations with Rebide. They found it difficult to establish diplomatic relations with others as the road to the continent was long. The Empress was a little puzzled as she did not understand why the Grand Duke insisted on her taking part in the discussion. She approached the prince and said that she would like to talk to him about something. The Empress asked why he wanted her to be the person in charge of the negotiations and discussions. She wondered why he had decided this since he had previously criticized her, pointing out that she had been unable to handle the situation with the concubine. The prince looked at her with a gentle smile and said that he still thought so. She was shocked as he smiled even in such a situation. At that very moment, he declared that there was no one in the empire more capable than her, so he wanted her to be responsible for the negotiations. She said that she did not belittle her knowledge, but she knew only a few words. He noted that many did not even know a few words. The Empress sighed heavily as she did not receive a proper answer from the prince. But at that very moment, the channel turned around and noticed the Emperor. The Empress asked what had happened, because she saw that he looked unwell. The Emperor immediately looked at her menacingly and said that it seemed she preferred foreigners. Navier sighed heavily and told the Emperor that it was not something he needed to worry about. He asked angrily how he could not worry since she was his wife. Navier sighed heavily as he had just reproached her, although he was the only one who had brought a concubine without her permission. At that very moment, he angrily asked if she really liked the prince that much. The Empress, looking away, said that they had communicated exclusively on business. She had no intention of continuing any further conversations and turned away from him that very moment. Following the discussion of diplomatic relations, there was a meeting with the Ministry of Finance regarding the budget for the coming year. After much discussion, the Empress said they could simply use last year's budget plan. But a moment later, she was puzzled and sighed as she knew that the budget for the concubine was still on the agenda. Unfortunately, they didn't know how much the lady spent, so they wanted to use the Countess's budget as a basis. After all the discussions, the Empress was left without dinner, but she was wondering if her new friend had visited her. A moment later, they heard some rustling in the distance. Madame looked out from around the corner and greeted the Empress. Artina looked closely at Madame, as she noticed that it was rude on her part. But there she sighed heavily and said that although she was no longer her maid of honor, she would like to tell her something. She said that the Viscount knew of some weakness of the concubine, but at that very moment she turned around and ran away in a hurry. The Empress looked around in bewilderment and noticed the concubine in front of her. Rashta looked intently at the Empress and said that she would like to ask her something. Rashta timidly said that she would like to talk about the Duke. Rashta asked if it was true that the Duchess was a depraved person. The Empress said with bewilderment that the Duchess was a good person and a wonderful friend. Rashta said that the Duchess was similar. She also liked being in the company of men, but she did not know whether this was allowed since the Duchess was already married. Navier sighed heavily and said that the Duchess was popular with everyone, both men and women. Rashta said that she was always with men at receptions, and she did not ask this with bad intentions. The Empress looked at the girl and said that the Duchess was fine, so she should not say anything like that again. That same evening, the Empress asked her lady-in-waiting if there were any bad rumors about the Duchess. Eliza reported that she had heard that the Viscount had fallen in love with her after their dance on New Year's Eve. At that very moment, the Empress asked her lady-in-waiting to inform her if she heard anything strange. The next day, the Emperor met with his wife and informed her that they must finish their work and leave within a day. At that moment, she was taken aback and remembered her holiday. He said with a smile that she really did forget everything in the world when she started her work, and he asked if she would mind if they left early. At that moment, the Emperor asked her if she remembered that they had planted a tree at the villa. In the Eastern Empire, there was a story about a wishing tree. The legend said that if they made a wish while planting the tree, it would come true. When she was crown princess, she was very short, so she wanted to become taller. When they were little, she would scream that if he planted a tree himself, she would have to do it again. But he smiled and assured her that they were a couple, and they had one soul between them, so it didn't matter whether she did it or he did it. She was touched by his words, and after this, they planted a tree together. But after some time, her young princess fell ill, and the young emperor was scolded for scraping his hands. Navier recalled their carefree time with a smile. He looked at her with a smile and noticed that the tree had fulfilled her wish after all, since she was now tall. She then prayed that she and the emperor would have a good relationship for the rest of their days. A few days before her birthday, she received many gifts. Also among the gifts was a love elixir. Navier looked at the amazing elixir in surprise, but moments later, she clearly heard her bird flying to her. She looked at the bird in surprise as he was carrying a large gift. She was puzzled and did not understand how the prince could force him to do something like this. She understood that he had to come to her personally. At that moment, she smiled and asked him if he didn't like that she said bad things about the prince. She noticed that it was very nice of him. At that very moment, the Empress smiled and tasted the wonderful cake, noting that it was very tasty. She tenderly thanked the bird for bringing her a beautiful but heavy cake. But a moment later, she noticed precious stones in the cake and said with chagrin that this was too much. She looked at the bird in surprise because for some reason he was crying. But a moment later, the queen was thrown into the air and flew away from the Empress. Some time later, the Empress visited the palace where the prince was staying as she wanted to thank him for the gift and inquire about the condition of the bird. At that very moment, she noticed the young man. Navier wondered if he knew about her and the prince. At the entrance, she said with a smile that she needed to talk to the prince. He smiled and said that he was very glad that she had come, because the prince had recently returned all in tears. But a moment later, he described it and said that it was the prince's bird. Opening the door slightly, the young man froze for a moment and informed the prince that the Empress had come to see him. But a moment later, the Empress saw the prince who was dressing hastily. She noticed that his eyes were red from crying. He extended his hand to her with a smile and asked for forgiveness, as he was a little busy. The Empress was a little puzzled. She did not know where she should look, since his chest was wide open. At that moment, she was taken aback and noticed his eyes. She was puzzled because for some reason he reminded her of the queen. Navier smiled and said that she came to thank him for the gift, but she also asked if he baked the cake himself. Heinley said with a smile that this was his hobby, and he even had his own kitchen in the Western Kingdom. Heinley asked if she could cook, and he also said that those who can't cook and those who can are made for each other. He looked at her with a smile and puzzled her, saying that there was no such saying in the empire. She looked at him puzzled and said that it was not so. The Empress said that she would like to see the queen. The prince said puzzled that his pet was currently hunting. At that very moment, the prince asked the Empress if she liked the gift, and he also asked if it was too much. He sighed and said that he was afraid that such a gift might be a burden for her, since they had not known each other for that long, but he hoped that she still liked the gift. At that moment, she smiled and said that she understood why everyone considered him a ladies' man, because he was very kind and caring. Heinley sighed heavily and said that it was all because of his friend, and that his friend really did like to flirt. Navier sighed heavily and asked if he really meant Duke Elgi Claudia. The prince was taken aback and asked if she knew him. After the duke was in the palace, there was no mention of their meeting with the prince. Moreover, she heard that he was involved with the concubine. She wanted to know if the young people had quarreled. At that very moment, the prince said that he would like to ask her for a favor. Heinley asked the empress to stay out of the duke's sight. She was a little puzzled and did not understand why he was saying such things. He said that every woman who had an affair with the duke doomed herself to misfortune, and sometimes it seemed to him that he looked like a living cursed doll. Heinley asked the empress not to look beautiful next to the duke, although he noted that she was already beautiful. Heinley said at that very moment, in all seriousness, that she could not be beautiful in front of him. After some time, the empress was already getting ready for the trip, but when she saw her husband, she was taken aback, as she had not seen his luggage or those accompanying him. Sovishu told his wife that he had urgent business to attend to, so she should go first. The empress asked what had happened that he could not go. He said that there were urgent unresolved matters, and he had to deal with them. The maid of honor looked at the empress with a smile and said that she very much hoped that they would be able to improve their relationship with the emperor. They also talked about divorce, but looking at the empress madame said that no matter how much she hated the emperor, she could not ask for a divorce. The empress sighed heavily and asked if they couldn't get a divorce, and if it would be better for them to make peace. Madame only smiled in response. The empress was puzzled, as she considered herself pathetic, since she could not even ask for a divorce. But even if she could do it, she would not have done so because she was prepared to become an empress from childhood. That same evening, the young lady happily ran to the emperor. But a moment later, she froze in place as she was struck by his beauty. Rashta shouted with admiration that he looked great. Looking at her lover, she asked if it was even legal to be so handsome. He smiled and said that the analysis was taking revenge on him. But after a moment, she asked him to look at a small stone. He noticed that the stone had the coat of arms of the blue bogan on it. She looked at him with admiration and said that he was a genius and asked how he figured it out. But at that very moment, she asked with a smile why he was dressed so beautifully. The emperor hugged her and said with a smile that he had told her a few days ago that he needed to go to the imperial villa. She wanted him to return to her as soon as possible. Sovishu said with a smile that he would return soon and she should behave well. After a moment, she said with a smile that she would accompany him, but as soon as they approached the carriage, the young lady noticed a small box. Sovishu said with a smile that he had prepared a gift for the empress. The girl asked in surprise if the empress had really been at the villa. Sovishu said that they would celebrate her birthday. Rashta was taken aback and said that she didn't even know that the empress had a birthday. He smiled and said that they didn't want to make it public, so only close friends and relatives know about it. Sovishu sighed heavily and said that she was probably upset since she only just found out about the birthday. Rashta said that they were family, and she wanted to give the empress something too, and the emperor noticed that she was very kind. Rashta hesitated, not knowing what to say to the emperor. At that moment, the emperor turned around and said with a smile that they would see each other soon. She quickly grabbed him by the collar of his clothes and asked if he couldn't take her with him. The emperor was puzzled. She said that, although she had not prepared a gift for the empress, if she did not celebrate her birthday with her, she would be disappointed. The emperor understood that the empress would be more upset if he brought her. She shouted that she had to be present at the celebration. The emperor sighed heavily and asked his beloved for forgiveness, as he had promised his wife that they would spend this day together. At that moment, the young lady puffed out her beautiful cheeks as she was offended. He asked if she was offended, and Rashta immediately said that she didn't like it when he was alone with another woman. The emperor smiled and said that they would go there together later. She asked if they were really going there for her birthday. She said that she preferred to celebrate with a lavish party, but she liked to be alone with the emperor. She quietly whispered to the emperor that she wanted many people to come to her birthday party, and then they should be left alone. A moment later, she was happily seeing the emperor off. Rashta stared at the emperor for a while, but at that very moment she patted herself on the cheeks because she knew that everything would be fine, and she had to come to her senses. She knew that the emperor and empress were in a political marriage, and nothing could happen between them. But a moment later, she froze in place as she saw a familiar person. At the same time, the empress enjoyed a pleasant sleep at the villa, but after some time, she finally woke up because she remembered that her birthday had already arrived. She knew that her husband was already on his way. But after some time, the emperor entered the room and noticed with a smile that she had come to rest, but was still reading a book. The empress was glad that he arrived so quickly. At that very moment, the emperor collapsed onto the sofa as he was very tired. The empress came closer to him and touched his forehead, taking him by surprise. She looked at him closely and informed him that he had a slight fever and should rest. But at the same moment, she was puzzled and wondered if there was a doctor at the imperial villa. The emperor saw that she was agitated by something, and at that very moment he took her hand. A moment later, he presented her with a gift. He slowly pulled out a beautiful necklace and asked her to turn around as he wanted to see how the necklace looked on her. After some hesitation, she finally went to meet him. After the emperor had done his work, he tenderly kissed her neck. Navier quickly turned around and frowned at the emperor. He reached out to her as if he wanted to kiss her, but she immediately slammed the jewelry box in front of him. The emperor was taken aback, as he did not expect such a thing. But at that very moment, he sighed heavily. He noticed that sometimes she behaved like a colleague, not like a spouse. Navier looked at him intently and said in all seriousness that his wife was also a colleague with hiccups and that he was going through life with her. He sighed with displeasure and asked why one should get married at all if spouses and colleagues are one and the same. He was dissatisfied with everything that was happening, and at that very moment, he left the room. The empress was puzzled by everything that was happening. A moment later, the maid of honor visited the empress and asked if she and the emperor had quarreled. The empress did not answer and said that the emperor had a fever and they must send for a doctor. The empress, also puzzled, said that she would like to eat alone. Navier was puzzled. She knew that she should not lose heart. But at that very moment, all her sorrows disappeared as she saw the queen. She looked at the bird in bewilderment and asked how he got into the villa. She assumed that he was looking for her, but at that very moment he hugged the empress, and she noticed that he was simply trying to comfort her. Navier kissed the bird with a contented smile, as she realized that she simply could not live without him. She didn't know where the prince found such a lovely bird. He looked at her intently, and at that very moment, she wondered if she should get a bird like that. She smiled and asked if he wanted a brother or sister, but the prince shook his head adamantly, as he didn't want anything like that. At that very moment, the maid of honor informed the empress that her husband had lost consciousness. The empress was shocked and quickly asked where the emperor was. Now Madame said that he was in the next room, and she also called the doctor. The empress said that someone needed to be sent to the capital for a doctor, and she also asked someone to take care of the bird, as it had flown a long distance. Navier looked closely at the beautiful bird and asked him to rest a little and then return to his owner. He looked after her with a puzzled expression as she ran towards her husband. After some time, the young lady was sitting and talking with the viscount, and he informed her that he needed money right now. She was taken aback, and at the same moment she said, puzzled, that he had previously said that he would be able to help her. She said with fury that he had not yet done anything but was already demanding money. The viscount said with a grin that he was raising her child, so she should pay the expenses. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He sighed heavily and said that it took him a lot of money to feed and clothe the child, as well as to raise him. The viscount looked at the girl intently and said that she must pay all expenses. The young lady was furious, but she knew that she could not object to him and asked how much he needed. At that very moment, the viscount began to calculate all the expenses for the child, but a moment later, he said with a grin that if she did not have money, then she could compensate for everything with jewelry. Rashta stood up at that very moment and went to the jewelry box. A moment later, she presented the viscount with several precious rings. She knew she had to find out everything about the child before the viscount started demanding more. She was afraid the child would not be hers. At that moment, he said with a grin that he would like to give her some advice. He asked if the emperor had gone with the empress to the villa, and he said with a grin that they must be having a good time together. He noticed that the empress could well have changed her feelings towards the emperor, The young lady was furious. She did not understand what he was talking about. At the same moment, he said with a grin that she understood perfectly well, because it was a good game. As he left, he said that if the emperor grew tired of her, she would be thrown out immediately. That same day, the young lady was informed that the emperor would not be able to come. She was worried and did not understand why this was so, since it was the empress's birthday today, so he could very well come tomorrow. She was informed that the emperor was ill. At that moment, the young lady turned pale and froze in place from shock. She wondered if they really got along. Rashta knew perfectly well that if the emperor was really sick, it was still a problem because the empress could take care of him, and at the same time, he could lose feelings for her. At that very moment, she asked the baron if she could go to the villa, as she would like to look after the emperor. He sighed heavily and said that he was very sorry, but issuing permits was not his responsibility. But he also said that if she was needed, the emperor and empress would send for her. After some time, the young lady, puzzled, counted the days since the emperor's departure. The duke greeted the young lady, but noticed that she had not looked well lately. He asked her if she was okay, but at that very moment, she said she was not okay. The duke asked in surprise what had happened, and he asked if she was upset because the emperor was ill. She sighed heavily and said that it was so, and that she also felt very sorry for the empress. The duke was surprised because he had not expected such a thing. Rashta sighed heavily and said that the empress remained at the villa to take care of the emperor. But even if the emperor was ill, he would still think only of her, and because of these feelings, she felt unwell. At that moment, the young man laughed, and she looked at him in bewilderment. The duke said mockingly that this was simply too obvious a lie. Rashta looked at him menacingly and said that she was serious. The duke said with a smile that he was very sorry, but when it came to men and women, he was very perceptive. He smiled and said that everything was fine, because she was very sweet at the same time. At that very moment, he asked her if she was afraid that the emperor and empress would become close. Rashta was embarrassed by such a question, but did not answer. At that very moment, the duke approached her and said that he had a very interesting idea. Rashta looked intently at the young man, and he in turn noticed that she was already on his fishing rod. At the same time, the empress was caring for her sick husband. After she placed the towel on his forehead, he winced and quietly said that he was cold. Navier looked closely at her husband and reported that the doctor examined him and said that he fell ill due to overwork. The emperor sighed heavily and said that he knew this because he had not slept when the examination was carried out. Navier sighed heavily and said that they shouldn't have come to the villa after all. The emperor sighed heavily and said that because of him, her birthday was ruined. She assured him that he didn't need to worry, since it would come next year too. The emperor was puzzled, and at that moment he said that he had the feeling that he was talking to a colleague. Navier looked closely at her husband, but said that the doctor advised him to rest for a few days. At the same moment, she asked whether she should call his concubine. The emperor was taken aback, as he did not expect such a thing, but still asked if she was making fun of him. She asked in bewilderment if he really thought she was making fun of him. He said that was exactly how it was, but she said that was not the case at all. He informed his wife that she should not call the concubine, as it would be unpleasant for her. Navier understood that when the concubine found out, she would blame her for this. She understood that if the concubine had come and taken care of the emperor, she could have returned and completed the pending matters. At that moment, the emperor said that Rashta was very sweet and charming when she spoke, but he would not be able to rest properly next to her because he would just like to sit in silence. The empress in turn understood perfectly well that his beloved would be very upset by this. A week later, the young lady met her lover with tears in her eyes. She quickly ran up to the emperor and hugged him tightly. But at the same time, she was sobbing and calling him the empress, looked at them sideways. She saw that the girl was very upset and burst into tears. At that moment, she turned away and asked her maids to bring her the documents she had put aside earlier. She returned to the palace and finished all the work that had been set up, and even some of her husband's affairs while he was recovering, while the days went by and everything was calm. Navier noticed that the concubine had not done anything strange lately, and she hoped that things would continue this way. In the northern part of the palace complex, there was a small mansion called the Crystal House. Once upon a time, a concubine of one emperor lived there, But nowadays it was rented for a few days by nobles, and tea parties were often held there. After some time, the empress turned around as she saw the duke with his concubine. The young man knelt before the empress and said with a smile that he was very pleased to finally meet her. In turn, he kissed her hand and looked straight into her eyes with a smile as he was glad that she recognized him. At that moment, the young lady timidly greeted the empress. Madame looked closely at everyone present and said with a smile that she had not been warned at all that the Duke and Lady Rashta would come to the tea party. The Duke looked at everyone present with a smile and said that he thought it would be a good idea to accompany the young lady to their tea party as he wanted to help her a little. At that very moment, he asked the Duchess if she was against it. She smiled but did not answer, but after a while, the atmosphere was tense between everyone. Navier understood that if she left first, it could become the talk of the nobles for a week. At the same moment, the Duchess asked if they had heard the news about the Baron. The young people immediately began to whisper, as they heard that he wanted to make his illegitimate son from his mistress an heir, and in order to pull this off, he even divorced his wife, while the Baroness took the children and returned to her parents. At that very moment, Rashta looked intently at everyone present and asked who Lady Alesia was. But a moment later, she was taken aback and froze in place as she felt the intense gaze of everyone present on her. The young man looked at the girl mockingly and said that she was her predecessor. Rashta looked at him in bewilderment, but he said that the young lady was the concubine of the previous emperor. Rashta said that the lady was the Baroness's cousin and that she was also a noblewoman. The young man smiled and said that this was so, and that he and the previous emperor had met at a ball. At that very moment, the young lady with a joyful smile asked how Lady Alesia was doing, but she didn't hear anything intelligible in response. The empress thought for a moment, and the young man said that he had heard that she had been expelled and that it was very sad. After some time, the young lady also happily communicated with the Duke and wondered whether people had really turned their backs on the Duchess. The Duke smiled and said that he didn't think it was enough now, but he knew that she could deal with it herself now. Rashta was taken aback and said sheepishly that she was not that good at it. He looked at her with a smile and said that it was sweet of her. But when he approached her, he quietly said that such tricks did not work on him. After a while, he stood up and said with a smile that he needed to leave for a while. Looking at the young lady, he said that she did not need to go with him. She looked after him in surprise but did not answer. In turn, the empress walked leisurely about her business. Suddenly, on her way, she noticed the Duke. He looked at her with a smile and said that he had been waiting for her for several hours, but at the same time, he assumed that she was really busy. Navier was surprised that he had waited for her for so long, so she asked how she could help him. LG Claudia looked at the empress with a smile as she got straight to the point. He liked it very much. At that moment, he said smiling that she probably knew that he and the prince were friends. She sighed heavily and said that she had heard about it. He assumed that she had heard about him too. Looking away, he said with a bowed grin that he had heard about the empress and the prince several times. LG Claudia asked the empress if the prince had mentioned him. She sighed heavily and said that they spoke about it very rarely. LG Claudia asked with a smile if the prince had said anything strange about him. The empress looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. At the same moment, he smiling asked if the prince had said anything unpleasant about him. The empress looked away as she hesitated with her answer. LG Claudia sighed heavily and said with a smile that the prince was constantly saying something unflattering about him to those he liked. She looked at the Duke in bewilderment and asked why he was telling her all this. She did not understand his intentions at all. The Duke smiled and said that when he saw her yesterday, he thought she was not the kind of person who would associate with someone like a prince. The empress looked at the Duke with puzzlement, because she had said almost nothing at their meeting yesterday, and he had already decided what kind of person she was. They had barely exchanged a few words of greeting. The Duke smiled and said that the prince wanted to associate with those who were his complete opposites, and that he, being frivolous, preferred those who were equally flighty. The empress, surprised, asked if he really meant to say that she was not suitable to be the prince's friend. LG Claudia said with a smile that this was not so, and he just wanted to give her a little advice. He informed the young empress that the prince was simply a two-faced man. He told the Empress that the prince could say one thing to her face and do something completely different behind her back. He was capable of offending people and at the same time smiling in a friendly manner, so he wanted her not to trust the prince too much. The Empress looked at him in bewilderment and asked if he was not a close friend of the prince. LG Claudia said with a smile that it was the prince who urgently called him to the empire. He asked the Empress if he hadn't told him about it. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he had known the prince for several years. But at that very moment, their conversation ended as the Emperor looked at them menacingly. The Duke bowed and said with a smile that on that note he was forced to leave her. At that very moment, the Emperor approached his wife, but at the same time, he looked at the Duke with bewilderment and menacingly. A few moments later, the Emperor sighed heavily and said that now everything was clear to him. The Empress looked at him in bewilderment. He looked at his wife with disdain and said that she clearly preferred foreigners. Looking away from his wife, he said that she had little experience in dealing with other men, and the fact that the Duke spoke so expressively did not mean that he was a good man. The Empress looked at her husband and asked who in his opinion was a good man. The Emperor sighed heavily and said that he was a good man, but at that moment he saw a puzzled expression on her face. But a moment later, he said that she should watch her behavior. Navier looked at the Emperor with fury and said that she would look for a worthy young man in the Eastern Empire. The Emperor was taken aback, as he did not expect to hear anything like this, but there was nothing to tell him, so he turned away and quickly walked about his business. The Empress was puzzled because he calmly brought the concubine, but at the same time, he did not want to hear that she had someone else. At that moment, she sighed heavily and looked into the distance, puzzled, because she did not know what the Duke wanted to say at the end. She knew she had to ask the prince directly about everything. Some time later, the young lady visited the Emperor. She circled around him happily and called him. Rashta asked the Emperor, puzzled, what was bothering him and whether it was connected with the Empress. He sighed heavily and said that it was not about that at all. Rashta looked closely at the Emperor and asked what was going on. She understood that she was asking him such a question in vain, since he would not tell her anything anyway. At that moment, the Emperor became thoughtful and asked if she was getting along with Duke Elgi. She smiled and happily said that they were close friends. The Emperor asked if the Duke was close to the Empress. She looked at him in surprise as she did not understand why he was asking her such questions. He immediately said that he had seen them talking very friendly during the day. The young lady thought for a moment and remembered that the Duke had left her in the morning. She remembered how he had suggested, a plan to seduce the Empress. Rashta was taken aback and wondered if he had really tried to seduce the Empress for her. But a moment later, her face changed, and with a smile, she told the Emperor that the Duke and the Empress were not close. He didn't believe her words, but she assured him that the Duke was friends only with her. The Emperor looked at her with a smile, because he saw that she was very kind. He asked with a smile if she was protecting the Empress, in case he might misunderstand something. She smiled and timidly asked if he had understood her intention. A moment later, the Emperor asked if she was wearing the rings he had given her earlier. Rashta was taken aback and looked at him in bewilderment. The Emperor said that he was talking about a ring with a red stone. Rashta was taken aback, as she remembered that she had given many rings to the Viscount, but she did not understand why he had spoken about that particular ring. The Emperor smiled and said that in fact, the gems in the ring were enchanted with magic, and if she wore it constantly, the scars would disappear. She was taken aback as she did not expect anything like that. At that very moment, she screamed and said that she had lost the ring. She said she didn't know and gave the ring to the maid. The Emperor laughed wildly when he heard this. She looked at the Emperor intently and asked if he would mind if she asked him again for a similar ring. He thought for a moment and remembered that the Empress had such a ring. At that very moment, he said that if he could get the ring, he would give it to her. The next day, the young lady met the Viscount and said that she had given him the rings a few days ago. She asked him what he had done with them, but she very much hoped that he had not sold them. The Viscount casually asked if he was supposed to wear them. She was very angry with such an answer, but at that very moment, Rashta ordered the Viscount to sit down. He looked at her with contempt, as it was impudent on her part. Rashta, looking at the man, said that she was no longer his slave, and he should help her, so with all this, he should not be so arrogant with her. The Viscount looked closely at the young lady, and sighing heavily, said that she was right. After a moment, he asked her if she had made a decision. She said that if they were to work together, she needed to make sure that he wouldn't screw things up and run away, so she wanted him to prove that she could trust him. The Viscount looked at her with a grin and agreed, but asked what he had to do to make her trust him. At that moment, she said that he had to find out Duchess Tuana's weakness. After some time, the young lady walked slowly down the corridor, but at the same time, she noticed the Empress. Rashta bowed low and greeted the Empress. The Empress also greeted the concubine, but she had no intention of continuing the dialogue with her Rashta. In turn, did not calm down and called the Empress. Navier looked at the girl in surprise and asked what had happened. Rashta timidly said that the Empress had a close friend, namely the prince. At the same moment, she asked her not to get close to the Duke. The Empress was taken aback, because she did not expect anything like this. Rashta shouted that when she had problems, the Duke believed in her and helped her. Navier looked at the girl in surprise, because she did not understand what she was even talking about. Rashta looked away from the Empress and asked her not to be offended. And since she already had many friends, she did not want the Empress to take away her only friend. At that moment, the Empress sighed heavily and asked the girl not to worry, as she and the Duke were not friends. The young lady beamed with happiness, but Navier said that this was what made them different. Rashta looked at the Empress in surprise, as she did not understand what she was talking about. The Empress said that the girl wanted to appropriate everything that belonged to her, but she did not need anything that belonged to someone else, because she was not so deprived that she could take away what belonged to someone else. The young lady, in turn, was very shocked by the Empress's words, and for a while she just stood there in a daze, staring intently at his trail. That same day, the Emperor dined with his wife. After some time, he plucked up the courage and asked his wife if she could lend him a desert flower. The Empress looked at her husband in bewilderment as he spoke about the ring she had bought from the merchant. She asked if he was really talking about the ring with healing magic. The Emperor sighed heavily and said that it was just that he didn't have such a ring now. She asked in surprise if he really needed it now. He said that someone had hurt their hands, so he wanted to help that person, but he promised that he would return the ring. She sighed heavily and said that his concubine must really have rough hands. The Emperor was taken aback, as he did not expect that she would see through him so quickly. Navier smiled and said that she did not want to give him the ring, especially since he wanted to give it to someone else. She asked if he could return the ring later. At that moment, the Emperor became upset and looked away from her, but the Empress said that she could lend him the ring. The Emperor was taken aback, as he did not expect her to change her mind so quickly, but the Empress was cunning and said that she would lend him the ring only on one condition. He looked at her with bewilderment, as if he did not understand what she was talking about. She smiled and said that he could give her one of his magical items as collateral, since she had someone to whom she would like to lend the item. He was puzzled and did not understand who she was talking about. She smiled and said that he did not like it when she communicated with foreigners, so she wanted to establish a relationship with some worthy young man from the empire. At that moment, the Emperor flared up with rage and asked if she was really going to give the imperial treasure to some man. He shouted that if she didn't want to lend him the ring, she could have simply refused. After some time, the Empress, upset, returned to her place, but on the way, she saw the depressed prince. At that very moment, she called him, and he beamed with joy. The Empress came closer to him and asked who he was holding in his hands. The prince smiled and said that it was only the queen's subordinate. Navier was surprised, as she assumed that it was his friend. Heinley, looking at the bird, said that he was a friend of the queen, but officially he was a subordinate. At that moment, the Empress laughed and said that it seemed that all the prince's birds had more expressive faces, because the queen's had a surprised, thoughtful, and shy expression, but this bird looked angry. Heinley said with a smile that the bird always looked as if it was telling everyone to leave him alone. Stroking the bird, the Empress asked if she could hug him, but at that very moment, Heinley sternly refused her. The Empress looked at him in bewilderment, since she did not understand why he flatly refused her. Heinley sighed heavily and said that she couldn't hold him back, and besides, it was time for him to go to his room. The Empress looked closely at the bird and noticed that it was flapping its wings somewhat sluggishly. She asked the prince if he was ill. The prince sighed and said that he was just sulking and that he would find out later what was the matter. Navier asked if he really knew how to talk to princes. The prince sighed heavily and said that he was probably offended because he didn't let the empress hug him, and most likely he was just going to beat him in revenge. At that moment, the empress burst into laughter and said that it all reminded her of the queen. He looked at her in bewilderment, but the empress only smiled and said that Anna patted the queen on the back sometimes. She said with a smile that the bird had a simply lovely back. Filled with embarrassment, the prince thanked her. She looked closely at the young man as she saw that he was embarrassed by her words, but it was very sweet. At that moment, she said that she would like to ask him something. Heinley looked at her with bewilderment and said that she could ask whatever she wanted. The empress reported that she had recently met the duke on her way. Heinley was taken aback and asked if he was in the group with her. The empress said that this was not the case. However, she noticed that he said something strange. Navier looked closely at the prince and said that the duke told her that it was the prince who called him to the empire. She also said that they were interrupted, but the duke managed to say that they had been preparing for something for several years. She looked closely at the young man and said that she thought he had been developing some kind of plan for several years. Navier, without taking her eyes off the prince, asked what he was really planning. Heinley instantly flinched, not knowing how to answer her question. The empress looked at the prince closely and said that thinking that what he had been doing for years was his plan. She asked what his actions were. He looked away from her, not knowing what to do. She was shocked because it was the first time she saw such an expression on his face. Heinley sighed heavily and told the empress that he did not want to lie to her. She sighed heavily and accepted his words, as she saw that he was truly sincere with her, but she also knew that there was something else he wasn't telling her. Navier smiled and said that it was okay if he couldn't tell her now. After some time, the prince returned to his chambers, and McKenna asked the prince what had happened. But the prince did not give an answer to his subordinate, and the young man wondered what had really happened, since his master had ordered him to turn into a bird to show off in front of the empress. McKenna came closer to the prince and asked what he had done with the empress. McKenna immediately realized that the prince had really done something wrong. At that very moment, the prince cried out in confusion that he was much more in love with her than he thought. The young man asked the prince in confusion what he was talking about. Heinley sighed heavily and said that he thought he had told her something wrong. McKenna asked in surprise if the prince had made a mistake in front of the empress. The prince was very puzzled and worried that she would begin to avoid him, closely watching him from afar. McKenna asked the prince if the empress had realized that the prince was a bird. At that moment, the prince sighed heavily and shouted that this was not so. After some time, the empress told the vice captain that she wanted her to investigate something secret. Navier looked closely at her subordinate and asked her to monitor all movements of the prince and the duke. Artina understood perfectly well why she needed to follow the duke, but she didn't understand why she needed to follow the prince. The empress sighed heavily and told the girl to find out about all their movements before the New Year celebration and before their arrival at the palace of the Eastern Empire. Artina bowed at the same moment and told the empress that she would certainly find out everything. Navier knew that the Western Kingdom was the most powerful rival of the great empire, but other than that, there was nothing remarkable. She was puzzled and did not understand what they were really planning. After some time, the concubine met with the Viscount, and she reported that he had arrived to her faster than she had expected. Rashta asked if he had found any useful information. The Viscount looked at her with a smile and said that she had very valuable information, but that it was not difficult to obtain it. A moment later, he handed her the document and asked her to read it. A moment later, the Viscount noticed the angry expression on the young lady's face. He was taken aback and awkwardly said that the emperor had already taught her to read. He sighed heavily and said that Nyan was a noble and beautiful lady. The Marquise was a young man who was devoted to the temple, and at the same time, the young lady was his fiancée. He said with an onion grin that this was the most common story in the empire. Rashta shouted to the Viscount that she asked him to find out directly about the Duchess. He sighed heavily and said that the aforementioned lady was the Duchess. The Viscount asked if the girl really thought that she was a duchess from birth. Rashta asked with bewilderment if the Marquise was really a duchess. He said with a grin that the Marquis was once the Duke's eldest son, and now he was known as Lord Marion Rashta, asked in bewilderment what his words meant. He sighed heavily and said that he would definitely tell her the simplest version, namely, the story of the elder brother of Duke Tuanya, that is brother Marianne, who fell in love with the bride of his younger brother, Duchess Tuanya. At the same time, the young man even pursued her, and they had a pretty good relationship. But in the end, the Duchess married the younger brother, and the lord was shocked. He renounced his rights to the inheritance and dedicated himself to the temple. The lady was shocked and did not understand why he would give up everything. The Viscount said that he himself did not know the details, but the problem was that less than a week had passed since he committed suicide. Rashta thought for a moment as she understood that this was not the Duchess's weakness, and even if she had killed him herself, the man said with a grin that the incident had sparked some rather unpleasant rumors, as the Duchess had given birth to a child 7 months after the wedding. They claimed that she had given birth prematurely, but people assumed that it was the Lord's child, and the newspaper that published such a story as a rumor was destroyed. Rashta in turn was shocked by what she heard. She understood that this was very good information for her. At that very moment, she rewarded the Viscount with beautiful jewels. She looked at the Viscount intently and said that he had boarded the boat and would therefore have to do a little work. She said that earlier he told her that the Lord had committed suicide in the temple. He looked at her in confusion as he knew it was true. She said that he should pay the people around the temple and spread the story. They are the ones who should tell that, before the death of the Lord, a very beautiful woman visited the temple several times. The Viscount was taken aback and asked in surprise if she really wanted to attack the Duchess. He wondered if one rumor was enough. At that very moment, the young lady with a sly grin said that that would be enough. There was only one person who was always dissatisfied with the Duchess at balls. Rashta knew perfectly well that it was none other than the Duke, but she assumed that the Duchess had upset him. If they pushed him, he would explode. She knew that if such a rumor spread through high society, the rumor that she was a slave would disappear forever. Rashta understood perfectly well that now that everything was decided, she needed to find out about her child. She understood that she could not trust anyone. This question, she consoled herself wondering if there really was no one she could trust. That same evening, the Empress read the letter. They thanked her because thanks to the Empress's support, a child from an orphanage was able to enter a magic academy for the first time, so they wanted to express their gratitude to her to all the staff. She wanted to congratulate them personally on such wonderful news, but she knew that she had to discuss this issue with her husband. After some time, the Empress visited her husband and asked if he had really found the desert flower. He sighed heavily and said that in fact, he had given the ring to the concubine, but she was ignorant and gave it to a poor servant. The Empress asked in surprise if the girl really did not know about the power of the ring. He sighed heavily and said that for this reason, he asked the Count to look for a similar ring, and then he brought him the ring and said that he bought it at auction. The Empress said that most likely the maid needed money, and she sold it. The Emperor said he thought the same, but he wondered if a commoner would sell something so valuable for a reasonable price. He said he had asked the Count to find out how much the woman had received for selling the ring. He looked with joy at the beautiful ring, because he knew that he would soon learn the result of his beloved's sincerity. He understood that she really wanted to help the poor servant. The Count greeted the Emperor for a while, and the Emperor in turn inquired how his search had gone. He was curious how much the maid had demanded for the beautiful ring. The man sighed heavily and said that after searching, the price remained the same, but there was something suspicious. The Emperor asked in bewilderment what had happened. The Count said that he had been told that the ring had been sold to me by a servant. The Emperor looked at the man with bewilderment and anger and asked who had sold the ring. The man was immediately taken aback, not knowing how to answer the question, but gathering his courage, he said that it was none other than Viscount Rotashu. Rashta looked sadly at her jewelry, which was gradually disappearing from her jewelry box. She knew that if she only found out whose child was living with the Viscount, she would not interfere in this matter. But a moment later, she hid the box and ran to the door because she heard that the Emperor had come to her. Sovishu grabbed his concubine by the shoulder and said menacingly that he would like to know something. She was taken aback, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He looked at her intently and said that he would like to talk about the desert flower, since she herself had mentioned earlier that she had lent the ring to the maid. The young lady was taken aback as she did not understand why he suddenly asked her such an unexpected question. She trembled for a moment and wondered if the emperor had found out that she had given the ring to the viscount. At the same moment, she hesitantly said that the maid was not the only one to whom she had given rings. He looked at her with fury and asked who else she had given the jewelry to. She said that she gave the rings to the maid and also to the viscount, since for her they were all the same, and in fact she did not know who had the ring now. He always looked at her with a knowing look and asked why she said that she gave it to the maid. She sighed heavily and said that she gave it to the viscount, but was afraid that the emperor would be angry when he found out about this. He looked at her intently and said that he didn't like it at all. At that moment, the young lady ran up to the emperor and hugged him, asking for forgiveness. She said that she just wanted to thank the viscount for lying to help her. Sovishu looked intently at his beloved and said that it was not for her sake, because he simply took responsibility for what he said. She asked in surprise if this was really true. At that very moment, the emperor threateningly confirmed his words. But moments later, he asked his beloved if anyone had threatened her recently. She said with a joyful smile that no one had threatened her, and in general, she did not know what anyone could threaten her with. She said that he just spread a rumor that she was a slave, and later he took back his words, so she wanted to thank him. The emperor looked at her sideways and said that he believed her, but he was still worried that the man could threaten her. The emperor immediately said that she should not do anything and should immediately go to him. The young lady, with a joyful smile, said that she understood him. At the same moment, he said that this was an order, but also said that he would check every day, and when her allowance was prepared, the baron would organize everything. The emperor told his beloved that she did not need to worry about the concrete until she could do it herself. The young lady was taken aback as she realized that everything was not going as she wanted. She was puzzled and at the same time scared because she understood that she would not be able to give the viscount the jewels or the money, and this would become a big problem for her in the future. The empress visited the magical city, and at the same time, she congratulated the young lady on her entry into the academies. The young lady happily greeted the empress and thanked her for her support. The man looked at the empress with a smile as he noticed that their student was a very talented girl. The empress said with a smile that this was true, but she still wanted the director to take care of her. After some time, they leisurely walked around the academy, and the man said that they were very concerned about the decline in the number of mages. The empress said that she had read the report, but still wanted to know if the reason was known. The director said that they tried to find out, but the number of mages was decreasing. The empress noticed that the fewer magicians there were, the more the county's defenses suffered. A moment later, they stopped near the portraits of the academy's graduates. She looked at the beautiful portraits with surprise, as she noticed that the Grand Duke was there, and she also saw the last dean of the academy. But at that very moment, she asked why one seat was empty. The man nervously said that the student was studying as an exchange student from another country, but this frame was empty because he dropped out of the academy. The empress was surprised, but still wanted to know who that person was. The man smiled and said that it was none other than Prince Heinley of the Western Kingdom. Navir was taken aback, as she had never heard of anything like this before. The man sighed and said that this was not something they were so proud of. He looked at the empress with a smile and said that the prince asked them not to tell anyone. She asked in surprise if they would get into trouble because of what he told her. The man smiled and said that the prince had suddenly visited them yesterday and said that it would be okay if he told the guest about the empty frame. The empress was a little surprised, as she did not understand when the prince had managed to do everything and visit the academy. She understood that now that she was aware that the prince could use magic, it would be much more difficult for her to find out about his plan. But a moment later, she saw the prince and his assistant in front of her. Heinley greeted the empress with a joyful smile, as he did not expect them to meet at the academy. Navaire was also surprised, as she did not expect to see him. Heinley said with a cheerful smile that he had some business at the academy. He said with a smile that they met without even planning a meeting, and it was just fate. At that moment, the empress looked intently at the young man, since he was assigned to her, but she still asked the prince why he was in such a place. He said with a smile that the dean had told him that he wanted to see him. At that moment, she was taken aback as she remembered that the dean had said that the prince had suddenly visited them. She realized that this was very different from the dean's words and assumed that this was part of his plan. Heinley said with a joyful smile that it was fate to meet her here, all things considered, so he invited her to dine with him. The Empress looked at him intently, but did not answer, but after a few minutes, she finally agreed with him. After a few minutes of their meal together, the Empress smiled and told the prince that he really did look like the queen. He was surprised, but she assured him that this was true, because the bird had golden feathers and purple eyes. Heinley asked with a satisfied smile if that was really so. At that very moment, he approached the Empress and with a sly smile asked if he really looked like a bird. Navier looked intently into his beautiful eyes, which reminded her of a violet flower. He asked her with a gentle smile if she knew that she had very beautiful eyes. She sighed heavily and said that he always praised women. He asked if she had always hypnotized people with her beautiful eyes. The Empress immediately sighed heavily and said with a smile that he was exaggerating. A moment later, they were brought more treats. Navier looked closely at the prince and said that the dean told her that he had a talent for magic. Heinley asked with a smile if he had really told her anything. She smiled and said that, as far as she knew, every magician had his own power. Heinley revealed that others could use his magic and vice versa. Navier looked closely at the prince and said that, if that was the case, she would like to know what his abilities really were. The prince thought for a moment, not knowing how to answer the question posed. But a moment later, he said he could fly. Navier looked at him in surprise, but smiled and said that was very cool. She also asked if he'd ever taken anyone with him on a flight, and she also asked if he could take her. The prince was taken aback and froze for a moment in shock, not knowing what to answer. At that moment, he looked away from her in embarrassment and said with bewilderment that she was too heavy for him. The Empress froze in shock, as she had not expected to hear anything like that addressed to her. But at that very moment, the prince timidly said that he had not meant anything bad at all, and that he did not consider her fat at all. He simply would not be able to carry her. At that very moment, he asked her in bewilderment whether she was angry with him. She said that she was not angry, but he noticed that she answered in monosyllables, which meant that she was definitely angry with him. But the Empress, sighing heavily, said that she was not angry. The following evening, the young Empress enjoyed her bath. She told her maids of honor that her trip had been a success, and also inquired about what had happened while she was not at the palace. The maids said that she should not even ask, since there was simply some kind of madness in the palace. She looked at them in surprise and asked what had happened. Eliza said that the Duchess had fought with a woman. They were so furious that they even tore each other's hair out. The Empress was shocked. She had not expected anything like that. Eliza reported that Duke Elgi had rented out the entire opera house to throw a surprise evening, but the Duke was famous, so a lot of people had come. And during this event, Duchess Tuania and Duke Elgi were seen together on the balcony. The Empress asked if they were alone. Eliza reported that they were the most popular among the rest, and naturally all eyes were on them. The Duke came out first, and at that time the Emperor's concubine was talking with the Grand Duke. Then someone asked where Duke Elgi was and whether he had any special interest in the Duchess. She looked at them in surprise and asked what he answered. The Duke smiled and said that he understood why many men were in love with the Duchess. Eliza sighed heavily and said that these were exactly the words the Duke had said, and she did not see what happened after that. She also did not know the reasons, but a terrible commotion began. At the same time, Laura was screaming that something crazy had happened next. She hastily informed the Empress that the Duchess had slapped the Duke, and very hard, and the Duke had even turned his head the other way. And then out of nowhere a woman appeared and grabbed the Duchess by the hair from behind. The Empress was shocked by everything she heard. Laura reported that it was one of the Duke's ex-girlfriends and that she was pursuing him even though they had separated long ago. The Empress sighed heavily and wondered if she really didn't understand why the Duchess had done this. Navier knew that such incidents were not uncommon in high society, but she was still worried about this situation. Eliza looked closely at the Empress and asked her not to worry so much. She said with a smile that such incidents were not uncommon, and soon everyone would forget about this situation and move on to something else. After some time, the Empress sipped the wonderful tea with pleasure, but a moment later, she turned around as she heard the Queen knocking on her door. She quickly took the queen, as she saw that he was exhausted. Laura ran to the bird in a hurry as she was bringing her water. At that moment, everyone was watching the queen closely as he drank the greedy water. But a moment later, the young empress breathed a sigh of relief as she saw that he was feeling better. She reached for the queen, but he dodged. A moment later, he looked at her intently and called her to him. She did not understand anything, but at that very moment, he flew up to her and pulled her by the hand. The empress looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he wanted to tell her. He pulled her and called her somewhere, but it was all in vain since she did not move from her place. He was puzzled and realized that he would not succeed. At that moment, he sighed heavily and sat down on the ground. The empress looked at her pet with a smile, as she noticed that sometimes he behaved like a human. She came closer to him and asked what had happened. Navier picked him up and asked if he really wanted to take her somewhere. A moment later, he quietly flew away from her. She wondered if he really wanted to take her to the palace to the prince. The next day, she was tired and went about her business. But a moment later, the empress was taken aback as she saw the concubine who greeted her with joy. Rashta looked closely at the empress and asked if she could spare her a few minutes of her precious time. The empress sighed heavily and told the concubine that she could speak. But a moment later, the empress noticed that the girl from the piece was looking at her protector. She noticed this and let her protector go, and also asked the concubine what had happened. Rashta sighed heavily and said that she had heard that concubines receive an allowance. She asked how much she was entitled to. At that very moment, the empress informed the young lady how much she would receive per year. Rashta, in turn, beamed with happiness when she heard the given amount. But she still asked when she could get them. The empress said that she would receive the money from the next month, but she also asked why the girl needed the money. She sighed heavily and said that she had her own reasons. Rashta, is the money intended for recording somewhere? The empress said that everything is recorded in a large ledger. She sighed heavily and said that yesterday the emperor informed her that her money would be transferred to the baron. She looked timidly at the empress and asked if she could give her some of the money personally. The empress looked at her in surprise as she did not expect such a thing. The empress told the girl that even if her money was with the baron, he would not interfere in her affairs, so she did not need to worry because it was still her money. She was taken aback and said that that was not the issue at all. Nervously, the young lady looked away from the empress and asked if she could give her at least part of the money without recording this information in the ledger, since she had heard that double-entry bookkeeping existed. The empress knew that this was not impossible, but she still said that it would be better if the girl first inquired about everything from the Emperor Navier, said that the emperor controls everything that concerns her. After some time, the young lady in turn was out of sorts, and the duke asked what was wrong with her face. Rashta, sighing heavily, said that the empress was very cold towards her. He asked in surprise if they had really had a fight, since he knew that the empress was not one to start a quarrel. Rashta asked if the duke was acquainted with the empress. He smiled and said that the empress knew her worth, and at the same time, she behaved like a true empress because she had excellent manners and a well-trained speech. Rashta asked in surprise if he had really understood all this just by talking to her a little. In fact, he had been observing the empress for a long time, but in turn, he said with a smile that this was so. Rashta sighed heavily and said that she had asked the empress to give her part of the money from the allowance, but not to record it in the accounting book, but she had refused her. He asked in surprise why she needed money. Rashta sadly said that she just needed money. The duke was surprised because he knew that the emperor gives her everything she wants. Rashta looked away from him and said that everything was not so simple, because the emperor said that her money would be with the baron, and in order to use it, she would have to say what she wanted to spend it on. He looked at her in surprise because he didn't understand what was going on. But a moment later, the duke understood everything and said with a smile that he could lend her some money. She asked in surprise if this was true. He smiled and said that he would write her a credit check for the exact amount. LG Claudia, looking at his companion, said that while she could not manage her money freely, he would not ask her for a refund for several years. She was surprised, and at the same time shocked. But still looking at her friend, the young lady agreed. But at that very moment, the duke said with a smile that he had one condition. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. But at that very moment, Elgi Claudia said that she should tell why she needed the money. Rashta was taken aback, as she did not know what to answer him. But the Duke said that he wanted to make sure that she was not being deceived. He looked at her with a smile and said that it was not a good idea to spend money without the Emperor's knowledge. At that very moment, he said that if she had gotten herself into something strange, then she should stop doing such things. She sighed heavily and began to tell him the whole story. The Empress looked closely at her companion as he announced that the theme of the ball would again be a masquerade, and the man added that the last mayoral council had been warmly received during the reign of the previous emperor. He was sure that everyone would like it this time too. The Empress immediately said that they should pay special attention to safety, since everyone would be wearing masks. But a moment later, she became distracted and looked intently into the distance as she again saw her husband's concubine. The man looked at the Empress in surprise and asked if she really wanted to talk to the lady. Navier asked if the girl hadn't been in the park yesterday as well. The man sighed heavily and said that it was so. But he also asked the Empress not to worry too much about the fact that she, a shrine-goer, was walking around in such a place. He said that she was just a simple concubine, and she might not be an expert in etiquette and court affairs, but she would learn everything with time. Navier sighed heavily and looked into the distance with confusion. She didn't know if this meant she had to be patient with the one who had been stalking her all this time. At that very moment, she told the man that he could be free. The man ran away in a hurry. A moment later, the Empress called for her protector. Navier slowly approached the young lady and asked why she was following her. Rashta, surprised, asked the Empress what she was talking about, but Navier sighed heavily and told the concubine not to say that this was not true at all. Navier said that she noticed that she was constantly near her. Rashta sighed heavily. Rashta immediately looked innocently at the Empress and said that the Duke told her that the Empress was a typical Empress, and since she was not a noblewoman, she had a lot to learn, and the Baron taught her, but she still did not know how to do much. Navier looked at the girl with bewilderment, since she did not understand what she was getting at. Rashta Krichala was saying that she wanted to be like the Empress, but she understood that the Empress did not want to teach her, and therefore she decided that she would be able to learn everything by observing the Empress from afar. Navier looked at the girl with bewilderment and said that if she wanted to learn etiquette, she should tell the Emperor about it. She could also ask the Viscountess to teach her everything. Rashta sighed heavily and said the Empress did not want to disturb her, and at the same time she asked the Empress to pretend that she did not see her. Rashta, looking at her companion, said that she would stay away and watch from afar. Navier in turn remembered the recent incident and realized that the young concubine was simply imitating her in everything. The Empress sighed heavily and told the girl that they did not know where she got such ideas from, but she knew that the Emperor loved her for who she was. And at the same time, the Empress noticed that the girl was completely different from her. She also said that the Duke became her friend for exactly the same reasons. The Empress told the girl that she should not follow her. The young lady tried to object, but the Empress said that if she decided to secretly follow her, she would not be able to stop her. But she still said that if she herself noticed her, she would order her knights to send her to another place. As she left, she looked menacingly at the young concubine and asked her not to pursue. Her Rashta looked long and intently after the Empress, but did not answer. A few days later, a public ball was held, a reception that anyone could attend regardless of status. It is very popular, as it is one of the few events where nobles and commoners could be together. When the level of support for the nobility was falling, the imperial family intended to organize public balls. Everyone knew that under the reign of the current emperor, public opinion was not at such a low level, and therefore there was no reason to hold public dances with Eliza smilingly telling her mistress that everyone would be amazed at her outfit, since she knew that no one could wear such a bright red as the Empress. The Empress looked at her in surprise and asked with a smile if it was really a compliment. Madame hesitated and thought. The Empress thought for a moment about what had happened since the concubine had recently stopped spying on her, openly, but continued to do such things secretly. She sighed heavily and slowly walked into the banquet hall. But at that very moment, Eliza froze in shock when she saw such a sight. Everyone was stunned and surprised as they saw the young lady in a beautiful outfit that looked like the outfit of the Empress. At that moment, everyone was puzzled and watched the high-ranking lords intently as they were stunned by everything that was happening. Rashta, in turn, reached out to the Empress since their outfits were similar. She looked closely at the Empress and asked if the Empress had deliberately worn a similar dress. Eliza was shocked and told the concubine that it was very rude of her. At that moment, Navier looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she had previously stated that she wanted to be like her. Navier asked if that meant that she wanted to imitate everything she did. Rashta was shocked by such words and indignantly asked the Empress why she was talking about this now. She shouted at the Empress that she was copying her at that moment. The Empress asked in bewilderment why she needed all this. Looking at the young concubine, she said that if she copied her outfit, she would laugh at them too, and at the same time, she noted that she did not need to do such a thing. As she left, the Empress sighed heavily and told the girl to think about this incident in the future. At that very moment, the young man ran up to the young lady as he saw that she was upset. A moment later, the Empress sat down in her rightful place and heard the whispers of all those present. Since everyone was actively discussing the situation, they did not understand why the concubine did not simply choose a different outfit. Artina sighed heavily and asked the Empress if she wanted to punish the rude people in any way. The Empress looked into the distance and said that it didn't even matter. At that moment, the young lady caught everyone's gaze on her. Everyone was whispering because they knew that she was the Emperor's mistress, and in addition, they heard that she was not a noblewoman at all. They also understood from this situation that the Empress was trying to ignore her. At that very moment, the young lady could not bear it and burst into tears. Laura was furious and wondered if all concubines were like her, but she was puzzled because she didn't know who had told the concubine the information about her outfit. A moment later, the Emperor arrived at his beloved's side, and after a few minutes of short conversation, he turned his gaze to his wife. A moment later, he looked intently at his wife. Eliza looked at her mistress with puzzlement and called her. At the same time, the young people smiled and said that they simply could not believe such a thing, and they did not expect to see the Empress and concubine in the same outfits. They also noticed that the Empress appeared after her concubine entered the hall. They understood that this was madness, and thus they hinted that it was the Empress who copied the concubine's outfit. The Empress sighed heavily and looked closely at everyone present who were actively discussing her. At that moment, the Emperor said that he asked the Empress to wear a red dress because it was New Year's Navir, looked towards the Emperor in surprise, as she did not expect him to defend her. Everyone was taken aback for a moment and looked intently at the Empress. The Emperor came closer to his wife and kissed her tenderly, and also noticed that she looked more beautiful than he could have imagined, and he also thanked her for fulfilling his request. The Empress looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand why he was lying, but she also played along with him and said with a smile that she was happy that he liked her outfit. At that very moment, everyone present changed according to the task, but noticed that this was the request of the Emperor himself. They were glad that the spouses got along well with each other, but the young concubine was offended and left them at that very moment. Navier was puzzled, as she did not understand why he helped her, but the Emperor still asked who actually copied whom. The Empress looked closely at her husband and asked him who he thought had copied whom. At that moment, he smiled and said that it didn't matter at all. The Empress asked with bewilderment why he had taken her side then. Sophie sighed heavily and said that he could not do anything about it, since the Empress was the face of the Eastern Empire, and she represented the honor of the imperial family. Soveshu, looking at his wife, he said that she needs to maintain prestige, and this is obvious. She sighed heavily and said that she understands this perfectly. But a moment later, the music began to play, and everyone saw the young concubine dancing in the distance. The Empress noticed the girl because she tried to attract attention. At the same time, everyone clapped with admiration, and the Emperor watched his beloved with a satisfied smile. The Empress asked her husband why he didn't dance with her. Sovishu looked at his wife in surprise and asked if she really wanted him to go to her. Navier said that he looked as if he wanted to go to his concubine. He looked at his wife in bewilderment and asked if she was jealous. The Empress immediately said that this was not so. He wondered if it was sarcasm coming from her lips. Sovishu knew that she always said something like that, and in a similar tone when she was angry, but the Empress, sighing heavily, said that she didn't care. Sovishu sighed heavily, as he thought that she was jealous of him, after all. He immediately asked if the previous Empress had taught her how to conduct verbal duels. He did not understand why she never gave in to an argument. The Empress looked at him in bewilderment and asked if he really wanted to know something like that. Sovishu thought for a moment, as the question interested him a little. She said that they could put aside their crowns for a while, and if they communicated without formalities, and at the same time they could create a conditional neutral zone. She would tell him everything he said, that she had once said something similar when they were crown prince and crown princess. But he then asked if she remembered what she did next. She sighed heavily and did not answer him, but still in those distant times, she simply knocked him out. The emperor sighed heavily and said that he would no longer fall for such a thing, because otherwise everything would end badly for him. At that very moment, the young lady happily left the stage, as she was having a lot of fun. But she was taken aback when she saw that the emperor was engaged in a lively conversation with his wife. She was surprised because she knew they were at a wonderful event, and the couple were still talking about politics. Rashta was a little puzzled, as she knew that the emperor never discussed politics with her. And at the same time, she was bored as the duke was away. She was puzzled because she didn't know if there was any information about the child. A moment later, she saw a familiar person in the distance. She saw that Duke Tuanya was sitting and drinking alcohol alone. A moment later, the emperor asked his wife if she would like a drink. Navier sighed heavily and refused, saying that it would be better to eat cake. He asked with a sly grin how many of these pieces she had already eaten. She didn't get tired and asked how much he had already drunk. He said that after this evening, rumors would spread that the empress loved sweets. She sighed heavily and said that she thought it was better than getting drunk in public. The emperor smiled and said that he had no intention of getting drunk to the point of intoxications. But at that very moment, the empress noticed that her husband's face had changed dramatically, and his mood had worsened. She looked intently into the distance and saw that his beloved was talking sweetly with the duke. At that moment, she glanced sideways at her husband and wondered if he was jealous. She sighed heavily because she knew that it was none of her business, and she didn't need to fill her head with such thoughts. But a moment later, she was distracted as the prince approached her and greeted her. Heinley asked with a smile if he could join her, since he was not a very good dancer. The empress was surprised, since she had previously thought otherwise. At that moment, the emperor looked intently at the young people. The prince looked at the emperor with a smile and said that he really hoped he didn't mind that he joined, but the emperor in his usual manner ignored the young prince. Navier looked closely at her husband. She knew that even if he had told her before that he was not jealous of her, he still did not like it when another man flirted with his wife. A few days later, Artina told her mistress about a small investigation, but a moment later, the young lady came to the empress and asked if she had heard the latest news. She immediately fell on her knees before the empress and shouted that it was true, very important. The empress asked in bewilderment what her maid of honor was talking about. Laura shouted that the main news was about Duchess Tuanya. At the same moment, the young lady also shouted that the duchess had demanded a divorce. She said that the duke was shouting very loudly that his son was not his, but his brother's, and that he could not help but doubt the duchess because she was behaving suspiciously. In addition, the duchess had a fight with another woman, allegedly because of the Duke of Elgo. Everyone in the capital was discussing this topic, as the duke stated that they accidentally conceived a child before marriage. But after the wedding, the duchess was never pregnant again. Everyone understood that the test was useless because the alleged fathers were brothers, and the results could be contradictory. Laura sighed heavily and wondered if the duke was too proud to admit his infertility. The empress was puzzled, as she knew that many years had passed since then. She did not understand why she was stirring up the past now. But after a few minutes of long thought, she asked her friends if this was somehow connected with the emperor's concubine. They looked at her in surprise, as they did not expect such a question. At that very moment, the empress asked her lady-in-waiting what the duchess had said. Laura sighed heavily and said that the duchess had said that she would not give a divorce voluntarily, and that the matter could go to court. Navier looked closely at her lady-in-waiting and asked her to find out why this story had suddenly surfaced. The empress understood that if this was the work of the emperor's concubine, she could go unpunished. She understood that if the girl really had set up this circus, It meant that she was capable of manipulating society and seizing power over it. A few days later, the Empress was informed that Viscount Landry had stabbed Rashta. The Empress was shocked by this news as she realized that something incredible had happened again, and that events were changing one after another at an incredible speed. The Empress thought for a moment and remembered the man who was in love with the Duchess. She sighed heavily and said that the Viscount probably decided that the Emperor's concubine had spread rumors about the Duchess. The maid hastily said that this was most likely the case, but at first everything was fine, and the lady even let him into her room herself. The Empress realized that the girl had specially invited him because she knew that he was in love with the Duchess. The maid reported that the Duke then burst into the room and said that he smelled blood and knocked down the door, thereby stopping the Viscount, and the young man was caught red-handed at the scene of the crime. They said that he screamed with rage when he was captured, and at the same time declared that the Emperor's concubine had ruined the Duchess's life. Navier in turn sighed heavily as this situation was burdensome, but she still asked what state the young lady was in now. The Emperor walked nervously around the room, as the doctor had previously said that her wounds were not life-threatening. He did not understand why it took him so long to examine her. But a moment later, the Duke approached the Emperor with a smile and called him. The Emperor sighed heavily and with a smile thanked the young man for saving his beloved. The Duke smiled and said, "They were just lucky that he was there." The Duke looked at the Emperor in bewilderment and wondered if he really didn't care that another man was visiting his concubine late at night. He knew that he would at least be surprised. But moments later, all their thoughts disappeared as the doctor screamed in surprise. The Emperor approached them in a hurry and asked what was the matter. The man looked at the Emperor with lightning speed and said that he could accept his congratulations since the young lady was pregnant. At that very moment, the Emperor was taken aback and froze in place in surprise. The next day, the Empress was informed that the Emperor had come to visit her. Navier was surprised that he came to her early in the morning, but she still asked her maids to let him in. Sauvichou entered his wife's room and froze for a moment, but a few minutes later he told his wife that his mistress was pregnant. Navier looked away from him, as it was very painful for her to hear such news. She sighed heavily and said that she could not congratulate him on this. Sauvichou said that, although the child would not be recognized as a member of the imperial family, he would still be his firstborn. Navier looked closely at her husband and said that she understood this. He said that she was not obliged to congratulate him at all, but he said that starting next month, she would increase the budget of Rashta in accordance with the budget intended for concubines with children. She sighed heavily, but still agreed to his demand. Sauvichou, looking at his wife, he said that the young lady had not yet regained consciousness, but her wounds were not life-threatening. He stared at his wife, as she did not show any emotion, and she did not respond. And after a moment, he sighed heavily and left her room. A few minutes later, the Empress turned around and saw the Queen at her window. She looked at the bird with bewilderment, as if she didn't know when he had managed to fly in. But at the same time, from the expression on his face, one could say that he had heard their entire conversation. A moment later, the Queen flew up to the Empress. Navier in turn froze for a moment, as she did not expect this. But at that very moment, he rushed into the Empress's arms. She was glad that he comforted her in this way, and she thanked him with a smile, as she felt better when he hugged her. After some time, the Empress sighed heavily and wondered what she should do when the concubine gave birth to a child. She understood that the Emperor's firstborn would be a beautiful child. She knew that this fact alone would make people fall in love with the child, but she understood that some might perceive the child coldly. After some time, the Empress reported that the prince had come to her and said that he urgently wanted to see her. Navier was surprised, as she did not expect to see him at such a late hour. She knew that he never came to her himself, so she wondered what had happened, but still she told the maid of honor to let him in. A few minutes later, the maid of honor bowed and left, leaving the gentleman alone. At that moment, the prince opened his arms and, looking at the Empress, said that he would like to console her. He asked if he could embrace her as a friend. At that moment, the Empress froze in surprise. But at the same time, Heinlein said that friends hug each other to support each other. Navier looked at her friend with a tender smile and agreed. At that moment, the prince hugged her tightly. The Empress leaned her head on his shoulder and noticed that he smelled like a queen. For a moment, the young man pulled away from the Empress and said that he really thought he was a scoundrel. She was surprised she had been traveling. What was he talking about? But then he said that he came to her because he knew she was upset and he wanted to console her. But now he had unworthy thoughts. Navier looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. But after a moment, she noticed that he froze in embarrassment. She calmly asked if it was because they were too close to each other. Heinley was taken aback and said that it was not that he said that she was upset, and he was acting like a complete fool. At that moment, he covered his face in embarrassment because he realized that he was digging a hole for himself. Navier looked at her comrade with a smile as he was acting funny. But a moment later, she announced that the tea would soon get cold, and so he should sit down. She saw his embarrassed face, and at the same time she liked it very much. She looked closely at the prince and said with a smile that if he were a woman, the emperor would definitely fall in love with him, and she also said that he had very beautiful eyes. Heinley said with a smile that she was indeed very original, and complimented her. At that moment, he smiled and said that if he were a woman, he would prefer to become her maid of honor. The empress was surprised, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The prince said that in that case he could sit with her all day. She was surprised and asked if he really wanted to be her maid of honor. He sighed and said that she should pay attention to what he said after these words. Some time later, Eliza informed her mistress that the duchess wanted to see her. The empress was surprised, as it was already late, but she still accepted the duchess, and the duchess told the empress that she was ashamed to ask for help, but she still begged the empress to save the viscount. The duchess informed the empress that the emperor had said that there would be no trial for the young man. The empress was surprised, as she had not expected such a thing, but at the same moment she assumed that it was because his concubine was pregnant. The duchess, with tears in her eyes, said that everything was exactly as it was, and that the emperor was going to bring charges for the attempted murder of a member of the imperial family. The empress was taken aback, as she understood that if there was no trial, the viscount would be immediately executed. Madame said that the viscount was a very decent young man, and not the kind of person who would do something like that without a good reason. She said that he should not have attacked even if he had been angry, and she believed that he should at least have had the right to a trial. She shouted that in that case, he would be able to explain the reason for his actions to the court and defend himself. The duchess understood that even if there was no trial, she hoped that she would be able to talk to him. The empress sighed heavily and said that she also could not believe such a thing. The empress reported that she suspected the emperor's young concubine while she was trying to undermine the duchess's reputation. Madame was taken aback, as she realized that the rumors were true. The empress said she was going to find out, so she wanted to personally ask the viscount about what really happened. She looked at the duchess intently and said that she could not go there right now, because the viscount was being interrogated by the emperor. But if the trial was not held for a century, he would be executed quickly. She asked the duchess not to worry too much, as she would visit him as soon as she could. At that moment, the duchess thanked the empress, but she still burst into bitter tears, as this situation was very sad. A moment later, she asked the empress if she could take the handkerchief for herself. The empress looked at her in surprise, but agreed to give her the handkerchief. The duchess was puzzled and did not know whether the viscount would be able to win the case or not. In any case, she intended to repay the empress for her kindness and concern. The empress looked at the duchess in bewilderment and said that she should not say such a thing, since this was not something for which she should be thanked. The duchess looked at the empress and said that she had helped her through the most difficult period of her life, and therefore she was grateful for her kindness. The duchess also asked the empress if she could hug her. The empress was surprised by this request, but still agreed. For a moment, Madame bowed low and said goodbye to the empress. After some time, the empress learned that the viscount had been sentenced to death, but she still went to see him in prison, wanting to find out the details from him. The man was taken aback when he saw that the empress had come to him. He looked at her in surprise, but at the same moment he came to his senses. He sighed heavily and asked the empress for forgiveness, as he knew he was obliged to stand up and greet her, but his legs, to his regret, did not obey him. She sighed heavily and said that everything was fine. He didn't need to worry, but in turn she wondered why he was smiling. At the same moment, the young man asked if anyone knew what she had done with the Duchess. He sighed heavily and said that he had shouted on purpose so that everyone would know what the emperor's concubine had done. Navier sighed heavily as she realized that this was the reason he continued to scream, even after he was detained. He said that he had acted very stupidly, and that he should have first thoroughly studied the information that he had managed to find out right away, but in his emotions, he immediately went to the concubine. He sighed heavily and said in a low voice that he had been too hasty and had made a huge mistake. At that moment, the empress looked at the young man and said that no one was talking about the girl being involved in the duchess's problems since it was all hidden. He was shocked because he knew that the duchess had suffered because of the girl, and this information was hidden from everyone. The empress sadly said that everyone forgot about it after it turned out that the concubine was pregnant. The young man Po turned purple with rage as he understood that such a thing could not happen. He was shocked and simply could not believe it. At that very moment, the empress, perplexed, informed him that they were going to execute him without trial. He was taken aback as he had not expected such a thing. But a moment later, the empress approached him and told him to look at her carefully. Navier told the man that she would not have told him this information if she was going to let him die. She looked at him intently and asked if he understood what she meant. At that very moment, he hurriedly asked if there was really a way to save him. He asked if she really wanted to take advantage of the special privilege that she was only allowed to use 3 times. She sighed heavily and said that she would like to do something similar. At that moment, the empress looked intently at the young man and said that now he must tell her what had actually happened. He was puzzled and said that he had already reported everything to the emperor, but this information seemed useless to him. The empress said that he should tell her everything again. The viscount said he had decided to find out where the rumors about the duchess had started, so he found himself in a village near the church where Sir Marion was buried. There in the bar, they were talking about the Duchess and Sir Marion, and at the same time, he tracked down those who began to tell these rumors. He reported that they all said the same thing, as if from a memorized script, and this was very strange. After all, even the most truthful rumors were subject to some changes from one story to another, but they all spoke the same thing about events that happened long ago. The empress looked closely at the young man and asked what happened next. He said that after that, he began asking the trap question to each of them separately, and that their answers did not agree because they had to deviate from the prepared text. He said that this was not enough to find out who started it all. Then he prepared portraits of those people who were active in social circles recently, speaking to point to the one who paid them to spread rumors. And then everyone pointed to the portrait of Viscount Roteshu. He looked at the empress and said that it was the emperor's concubine who ordered him to start spreading rumors. The empress asked in bewilderment why he thought so. He said that the viscount was a nobody and could not join any social circle until he got involved with the emperor's concubine, and he suddenly became famous after insulting her, and now the poor viscount was spending huge sums of money. The empress looked at the young man with puzzlement and asked if he had any evidence, namely records. He said that he had everything, and at that very moment he announced that the evidence was in his desk. But he did not understand why she needed his reports. The empress reported that the duchess asked her to save him. The young man was taken aback and hastily asked how she was feeling. He asked if she was angry with him. Constipation was more successful than action. The empress looked at the young man in bewilderment. She was surprised because she saw that he loved her very much, and at the same time, he was worried about the duchess, although his own life was in danger. She said that, unfortunately, she could not justify him completely, but she could turn his punishment into exile. He was shocked by what he heard, and a moment later, he looked at the empress with hope, as he was very glad to hear it. As she left, the empress said that he should inform her what things he would need, and she would hand over all the things to his butler. After some time, Artina presented her mistress with documents. After reading for a while, the empress learned that the viscount had received the desert flower ring from the emperor's concubine, and then sold it to an auction house. She was surprised because she didn't know how the viscount knew that the concubine had received the ring from the emperor. But after a moment, she put the thought aside because she knew it didn't matter. The next day, the empress met with her husband and said that he should change the viscount's punishment to exile. The emperor, casually, said that she should not interfere in this matter. He said that he was upset for many reasons, but his beloved was pregnant. He said that even if he didn't intend to, he almost killed his child. The emperor said that the only thing that mattered was that his child almost died, while he casually told the empress that if she wanted to quarrel with him, then she should just leave the office. Navier sighed heavily and said that in that case, she would investigate the Viscount's case herself. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was even talking about. As she left, the empress informed her husband that the Viscount had not done this to her in order to harm his child, and therefore she intended to consider the Viscount's case according to the law. She looked closely at her husband and announced that she also intended to consider Lady Rashta's case according to the law. Sovishu was surprised and asked if she really wanted to look into this matter. According to the law, he wanted to know what evidence she had for this. She said that she had a report, and the empress also said that she wanted to remind him that those who spread false information about members of high society, like the emperor's concubine, were bound, flogged, and imprisoned. The emperor looked at her with fury and said that he knew that she did not like Reshta, but he was furious and did not understand how she, the empress, could protect a murderer. Navier looked at him intently and said that he was also protecting a woman who tried to ruin another person's life by spreading false rumors. The emperor could not bear it and shouted angrily at his wife. He sighed heavily and asked if she really had no compassion for others. Navier said that she still had compassion for others, so she wanted to help the Viscount, but at the same moment she asked if she could ask him a question. Navier bowed her head and, sighing heavily, asked the emperor if he could really sympathize only with his concubine. It moved in a way he had not expected such a question to be. She said that he had only asked her about sympathy for Rashta, so she wanted to know if he only felt sorry for his concubine. The emperor was taken aback because he could not answer her question. At that very moment, he shouted that she had previously informed him that she had a report, so she should give it to him. The empress said that she would give him the report after the Viscount's departure. The emperor stood frozen in shock, not expecting to hear anything like that. But after a while, he reported that the Viscount's punishment had been changed, and he was sentenced to exile from the place of execution. The empress was glad that she had managed to save the Viscount, despite everything, but her heart was still heavy. She walked slowly along the path as she was immersed in her thoughts. But a moment later, she was taken aback and froze in place in surprise when she saw the queen. The empress was surprised as she did not expect to see a bird on her way, and especially with a letter in its beak. A moment later, she looked after him, puzzled, as she wanted to hug him, but he flew away. The prince informed his empress that his elder brother was seriously ill. He also reminded her of his blue-haired knight, since he was his cousin and personal bodyguard, and also secretary all in one. He said that she could take revenge on those who hurt her, and therefore suggested that she make him her lover. The empress sighed heavily as she understood that the prince's elder brother had become ill. She understood that the prince would soon leave the empire. But at that very moment, she was taken aback and turned around as the prince, with a gentle smile, asked why she looked upset. She was surprised because she didn't expect to see him so soon. But at that moment, she turned her attention to the blue-haired knight. Heinle looked at the empress with a smile and asked if she would like to take a short walk. At that moment, the empress agreed, and they walked slowly. The empress noticed that the prince had a muscular arm, and she assumed that he had trained a lot. But at that very moment, she shamed herself as she realized that she had simply gone crazy. She did not understand how she could think about something like that, since he was simply accompanying her. The prince looked at his companion in bewilderment and asked if she was hot, since she had blushed very much. He said she looked very strong and healthy, and he hoped she didn't have a cold. At the same time, the empress was seething with anger, but she calmly said that she had received his letter, and she also noted that he needed to practice writing letters, since most likely he was very nervous when writing such a thing. At that moment, she sighed heavily and said that she wanted to say something else. He smiled and said that he knew that, and in fact she wanted to ask if he trained a lot. She said that he didn't, and she was going to ask about his brother. He smiled and said that his brother didn't train much. At that very moment, he felt a piercing and angry gaze on himself, but the prince did not lose his composure, and at that very moment asked for forgiveness. Heinley sighed heavily and informed the Empress that his brother had indeed gotten worse. But fortunately, his life was not in danger yet. But he also reported that his brother was quite weak. The Empress looked at the prince with pity as he said that for now, her brother's life was not in danger, but she wondered if he meant that his condition could worsen further. At that very moment, he asked her what she thought about his proposal. She asked if he was really talking about her making an unusually handsome and high-ranking man her lover. He looked away from her, embarrassed, and said that if she was not interested, they could simply pretend to be lovers. But after a few seconds, the Empress asked if he really meant Prince Capmen. Heinley was taken aback and immediately cried out that this was not so. She looked at him calmly and said that she thought he was talking about him. The prince was shocked and cried out that this was not so. Navier looked at him intently and asked if he knew other unusually handsome high-ranking men. Heinley was upset by her question. At that moment, he came closer to her and asked if there were any other men. She smiled and said that she was just joking. Heinley asked if it was really a joke. Navier said she didn't want to be seen as a woman who would have an affair with someone she didn't even love for the sake of revenge. He sighed heavily as he realized what she meant when she joked. Sometime after their short walk, he said that he would return to the Western Kingdom. The Empress froze for a moment as she saw that he wanted to tell her something else. Heinley immediately looked at the Empress with sadness in his eyes and asked if she would miss him. The Empress froze for a moment as she did not expect such a question. She was stunned and just stood there for a moment, staring at him, as she had no answer to his question. But after a moment, she looked away from him and timidly said that she would miss him very much. A moment later, she said that she had spoken sincerely. The prince was pleased with such words, and at that very moment, he said that they were leaving right now. He sighed heavily, and looking away, said that it was too late, and it was time for him to go back. She did not answer him, but she was also sad. After some time, the emperor read the report that his wife had given him, and the man looked closely at the emperor and asked if he should destroy the report. The emperor sighed heavily and said that he would keep the report to himself for now. The young man was surprised, as he had assumed that the emperor would ask him to get rid of the document. That same evening, the young lady happily told her lover that she had their child in her belly. He said with a smile that if she needed anything or wanted to eat something, then she should tell him, smiling. He said with concern that he would get her everything she wanted. Rashta was very surprised, as she did not expect anything like this. But at that very moment, the emperor said with a smile that when the mother is happy, the child is happy. She froze for a moment in shock, and at that very moment, tears appeared on her face. Rashta couldn't bear it and burst into tears in front of the emperor. Sovishu was shocked by this and hastily asked if everything was okay with her. Rashta looked intently at her lover and, bursting into tears, said that this was not the issue at all, as she had always dreamed of hearing such words. At that very moment, she rushed to the emperor and, hugging him, said firmly that he was truly her savior. She cried and told her lover that he could not even imagine how much she loved him. Some time ago, she met the Duke. At this point, the Duke, puzzled, informed her that the child the Viscount was raising was her child. She was shocked to hear something like that. Rashta remembered how the previous young man, whom she had confided in, had said that he did not want to change his life for her. But now the emperor tenderly extended his helping hand to her and said that when the mother was happy, then the child was happy. She was shocked and excited at the same time. A moment later, she asked her friend if he had asked the temple for a check. He sighed heavily and said that he had not done so, since anyone who saw the child would say that it was hers, because it looked very much like her. The young lady was shocked and at the same time very angry, as she had been lied to about the child all this time. The Duke came closer to her and said that he had already told her before that he could lend her the money that she needed so much. Rashta asked how much he could lend her. He said that he would give her as much money as she needed. Rashta looked hesitantly at the young man and asked him about one amount. He sighed heavily and said that, of course, he would lend her a similar amount. Rashta looked closely at the bill he presented to her, as it was issued by the main bank of the continent, and it had a huge impact on the trust among the nobility. So she thanked him tenderly for such a. The Duke looked at her with a smile and said that if the Viscount continued to blackmail her, it could become a big problem, so she should quickly think of how to get rid of him. Rashta was puzzled and wondered if there was any solution. At that very moment, the young man stood up and told his companion that she shouldn't worry about such things. But as he was leaving, he stopped at the door and called her. He turned around and asked with a smile if she was interested in knowing about the child who lived with the Viscount. He asked if she wanted to know if it was a boy or a girl. After some time, Laura reported to her mistress that the emperor's concubine had woken up, and the emperor had run to her and even given her a luxurious chair in honor of this event. The maid of honor informed her mistress that the duchess had decided to divorce the duke, but they could not reach an agreement and had to go to court to discuss the division of property. They also reported that the viscount had been expelled